Randy, how are you today?
Good.
I appreciate you coming and hanging out with us. We've traveled all the way across the country to hear about some of these interesting ideas. Why don't you just start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you currently do?
Okay. Well, Randy Wray. I'm a professor at the Levy Institute of Bard College. It's an economics institute. We do research, we do scholarly papers, and for about 10 years, we've had a graduate program. So I teach in the graduate program at the Levy Institute. I used to also teach undergrad at Bard. Before that, I taught PhD students and a few courses for undergrads at University of Missouri, Kansas City. And before that, I started my career at University of Denver, where we had BA and MA.
So there's a lot of economists out there, but I think one of the reasons we're having this conversation is because your viewpoint is a little bit unique. Would that be fair to say? Heterodoxical is how I heard other people call it.
Well, it's even more narrow than heterodoxical, heterodoxy. I've always been a heterodox economist from the very beginning. And we are a subset of that just...
No, you're fine.
That focuses really closely on money, and we've developed a somewhat alternative view of money, alternative even to heterodoxy.
I would love to go back to the beginning, but let's just expand on that. Give me kind of the broad brush strokes of modern monetary theory, and maybe that's not the correct way of condensing down how you think about things. Maybe that's one part of what you do and talk about, but maybe talk to me about how some of the things that you believe and think about and write about and teach are different from the standard way that people view things.
Okay. Well, MMT focused in very directly on sovereign currency. So this is just part of the monetary system, of course. And it's part of, let's say, the state's money system, because we're focusing on those states that have what we define as a sovereign currency.
And could you explain what a sovereign currency is?
Yeah. So this would be a country that issues its own currency, that does not peg it to anything. So you don't peg to gold. It's not a gold standard. You don't peg to a currency board or to the U.S. dollar, which some countries do. So that's the first aspect.
That's like what Argentina is attempting to do, peg to the U.S. dollar.
Well, they did peg to the dollar.
They're trying to go back, or they're...
Well, they did. They tried it once. It had some benefits for a few years, and then it was like, the tossing the anchor to a drowning swimmer, and they got off it, and they did well for a while. Anyway, let's just go back to the definitions. So that's the first aspect. You have your own currency, and in technical jargon, it floats. The exchange rate floats. You don't peg the exchange rate. You don't promise to convert your currency to someone else's currency at a fixed rate.
Okay. Which is really relevant, because that's true of the United States. We probably wouldn't be having this conversation right now if it wasn't true of the United States. The United States issues their money, and because we have the global reserve currency, it's rare, at least maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, we don't really guarantee to pay people back in their currency. We say, we're going to pay you in our dollars. We're not worried about the Mexican peso. We're going to pay you in U.S. dollars.
Yeah. And all the big countries today have floating exchange rates. So they're in a similar situation. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is that the government only issues debt in its own currency.
Okay.
So the U.S. government never issues government debt in pesos.
Okay.
Or in euros.
Will anyone do things like that?
Mexico in the past, our close neighbor, has issued government debt in U.S. dollars.
And they said, we will pay you back in U.S. dollars.
Yeah, they had to make the interest payments in U.S. dollars, which meant they had to earn dollars because they can't create them. So this is why it makes a big difference. If the U.S. issued peso-denominated government debt and had to pay interest in pesos, we've got to get hold of the pesos. We cannot create those ourselves.
I guess one question I have there is, what would stop me, and I know we're going to get to the creation of new money, but what would stop me as the U.S. government from, I create let's say I owe $1 billion in pesos plus some amount of interest. I create the U.S. dollars and then I exchange them for pesos, and now I pay you back in pesos.
You can do that.
Okay, so it would be slightly inflationary in my currency.
Yeah, earn or buy.
Got it.
Foreign currency. That's
Got it.
Yes, you can buy it. And then the danger is maybe that will affect your exchange rate.
Okay.
Because you'll be supplying more of your currency into foreign exchange markets.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has heard supply and demand. Now, I don't hold completely to supply and demand explanations. It's not that simple. But probably if Mexico continued issuing more and more pesos to buy dollars to make payments on dollar-denominated debt, probably it's going to affect their exchange rate. Okay. So you only issue debt in your own currency. And if you issue debt in your own currency, for reasons we explore more, it's much easier to make payments in your own currency.
Mm-hmm. So if someone was not doing those various things, they would not be considered a sovereign currency nation.
Right. So those are the two big things. And we say that countries that do this have their own sovereign currency, and they are different from their currency issuers. They are different from currency users.
Okay.
And this makes a difference to their ability to make the payments. So we argue that a country that does this cannot be forced into involuntary default.
Mm-hmm.
Now, could the U.S. government voluntarily default on government bonds? Well, they could. They have not done it yet, but we know we've got to the precipice a few times because of the debt limit.
Mm-hmm.
So there has been this back and forth between the two parties, and both parties have played this game. Recently it's been the Republicans, but Democrats have played it before too, sort of threatening not to allow the government to spend by not raising the debt limit. So even though the government easily could make the payments on the debt using dollars, Congress won't raise the debt limit to allow them to do it.
Yeah, I believe one of the credit rating bodies actually downgraded the U.S. bond by from a plus to a minus or something like that, which certain people were up in arms about. But they're like, hey, if you guys are going to keep doing this game where you threaten, it's like the girlfriend or boyfriend that keeps threatening to leave. You're like, well, you can't keep doing this because I kind of am starting to believe you that you might do it.
Yeah, this is a purely a political thing, and I don't think it will happen. But yes, if they keep playing this game, maybe at one point, one party will decide we're going to do it.
Which hits on probably the biggest point that I have taken away from MMT is that we cannot fundamentally run out of money.
That's right.
Because we are a sovereign currency. Thus, if we begin to even run low on money, we get to go ahead and create new money and put it into the system, which does have other effects. But the primary effect is now that you have the money to pay those certain individual debts.
Yeah, I would go even further than that. In a sense, the government doesn't have or not have money. The government creates the money as it spends always.
Okay.
So it's always creating what it is spending. And I know that this sounds, that must be illegal or a bad idea. But in a way, it's true for businesses too. The difference is businesses can't create the money directly. Banks create the money for them. Okay, you're a businessman and you know this, that if you need to pay your wage bill or something, you have a relationship with a bank, a commercial bank, that will make those payments for you. Okay, what do? They credit your employee's demand deposit account, and you now owe the bank.
Mm-hmm.
So they are making the payment for you. They're creating those dollars when they make the payments. It's not that they take them in and then make the payments. They create the dollars when they make the payments. And what I'm saying is the federal government spends the same way. It's just that it doesn't go to private banks. It goes to the Fed. The Fed makes those payments for the Treasury.
So when you say the bank creates the currency, are you referring to like fractional banking where they don't need to have the amount of money that they're spending? I guess I'm a little fuzzy there.
Yeah, I know. Because many people have taken elementary money and banking class in school, and they used to teach this deposit multiplier idea. It was always wrong. It doesn't work that way.
Okay.
So they would give an example. You, as a depositor, deposit $100 in the bank, and the bank knows that the required reserve ratio, let's say, is 10%.
Not everyone's going to come and get their money all at once. That's when we had bank runs, right?
So the textbooks always use 10% because students can divide by 10.
It's a nice number. Yeah.
It was never that high.
That's right. It's like less than 1%, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So it's actually a very, very low number. So the idea is they only have to hold 10 and they can lend the other 90. And then they show you a deposit expansion process as those dollars sort of go through to other banks. The other banks do the same thing. And suddenly they have created $1,000 out of that initial deposit of 100.
Which is part of the license that they have as a bank, is to do that?
Well, but that's not the way that it works.
Okay.
That's what I'm arguing. What banks do, and you probably notice this when you go to your bank and you say, hey, I need a loan. Do they call up their manager of their bank's reserves and say, do we have any reserves that we can lend out? Do we have any extra reserves to make this loan? Never. What the loan officer does, looks you in the eyes, looks at your credit history, and trusts you and says, sure, we'll make that payment for you.
We are currently building a pretty big building, 63,000 square foot facility. So it's like a $7 million loan. So this is all very real for us right now.
Okay. So anyway, it never worked that way. The banks create the deposits at the time that they make the loans. And of course, you also know, you don't go to the bank with a wheelbarrow and come home with that $20 million in cash in the wheelbarrow.
They're just making the payments directly to the contractor for us.
Because we trust you, but we don't trust you that much.
It's funny because the last loan, they were letting us do that. They're like, we'll put the money in your account, you write the check. Now they're like, the checks are a little too big. You guys, we're paying these directly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they really trusted you a lot, but not even you would they go that far for.
Yeah.
You don't walk out of the bank with cash.
Okay. So, but I'm still a little fuzzy on how the bank has created money. So if we're not worried about the amount of deposits that they have, maybe they have, if our loan is 7 million, maybe they have, 7 million times 10, 70 million in there, so they can lend out that remaining on fractional reserve. But if that's not fundamentally where that bank is most likely getting that money, where does that money come from? Because they're not the Fed. They don't get to just go in and be like, beep, boop, we have $7 million in our account, right?
They can't, they're not putting money in their account.
Okay.
They're putting it in your employee's account.
Okay. So like the contractor.
Whoever you're paying.
Okay.
They make the payment for you. They credit their demand deposit. Now we know that probably your contractor uses a different bank.
I believe he does.
Okay. So what's going to happen is that your bank has to make a payment to that bank, which has credited the contractor.
Got it.
And they do this on the balance sheet of the Fed.
So would this be simpler if he has the same bank? Is the analogy simpler?
Simpler. It's straight on this bank's account. They create that demand deposit and they offset it on their asset side with your...
Because they never really needed to move any money in that. They're just moving the numbers there.
Okay. They're making a payment, creating the demand deposit.
Okay.
And offsetting it with your IOU. So their balance sheet balances. They have an asset, which is your IOU. They have a liability, which is the contract demand deposit.
Okay.
They created the money right there. Now, the only time the bank needs those reserves, so there's the only aspect of that deposit multiplier story that is true is the bank has to clear with other banks. Okay, and the way they do that is they get the reserve. The reserves are deposits at the Fed. So the Fed, let's say that your contractor used a different bank, the Fed will debit your bank's reserves and credit that bank's reserves. So that's the only thing that reserves are used for. They're used for clearing. It's not that they lend out part of their reserves to you. It's that they have to clear with other banks. That's what reserves are for. Banks could operate perfectly fine with zero reserve balances all the time. Okay? They would just always borrow them when they need them. Now,
You'd borrow them from
the Fed.
The Fed.
In the aggregate, every bank is making payments and receiving payments, losing reserves and gaining reserves many, many times throughout the day. Okay, at the end of the day, that's when they need to make sure that they've made all their payments, and they will net borrow from the Fed.
And that's where the interest rate comes in. Am I correct in saying that?
So there are two interest rates that matter to the bank when they make all of these things, decisions, make all the payments and have to clear in reserves. One is the Fed will lend to them at what is called the discount rate. Okay. You don't hear about that one very often because we've had such a huge quantity, trillions of dollars of extra reserves in the system that banks don't need. So all the banks have reserves they don't need. So they don't have to go to the Fed to borrow because they're all flush with reserves because of quantitative easing.
Okay. We'll get into QE.
Yeah. The other interest rate that matters and the one you hear about all the time is the Fed funds rate.
That's why my mortgage would be so high, right?
Right. So the Fed controls that one, but it doesn't set it. Okay. It has a target for it, but it doesn't directly determine it. It's determined in the markets by the banks, by lending and borrowing reserves. So I have extra, I'm a bank, you're a bank. I have extra reserves, you're short reserves. You need to do some clearing, you need to borrow. I say, well, okay, I'll lend them to you at 5%. And you look around, and if that's the best deal you can get, you'll borrow from me. But if there's other banks say, we'll give you 4, then you're going to go to them. So that market rate is going to adjust because I can't make the loans at 5 if everyone else is making them at 4. So I'm going to start coming down. So we get an equilibrium Fed funds rate.
Okay. So is that the rate that we're hearing about on day-to-day, on CNBC, on Squawk Box? Fed's, what's he going to do in September? That's what we're hearing about?
Yeah.
But so the difference is the banks are charging a little bit extra to each other, essentially, to make a little margin. Am I following them?
But the Fed is setting it as the target.
The target. But they're not lending to banks at that rate.
No. In fact, if the Fed lends now in this environment with so many extra reserves, where all banks have extra reserves, they're trying to lend reserves themselves, no one's going to go to the Fed. The Fed generally charges what we call a penalty rate, a little bit higher. Oh, yeah, a little bit higher to discourage you from coming to the Fed. So if you go to the Fed, what do we know about you?
You're hard up for cash.
You're a bad bank.
You really need cash.
You're a bad bank.
Okay. So then a mortgage that I'm getting from my bank, that is mostly being impacted, yes, by the Fed rate, but they're not actually getting the cash from the Fed. The Fed is saying this is our target rate, and then the other banks are kind of falling into, okay, that rate kind of makes sense. That's what they're targeting. If the Fed rate is, I don't know what it is, 5.75 or something like that right now. Then they're going to say, okay, well, maybe we can be a little bit less. Maybe we need to be about that. Maybe we need to be a little bit more. But the actual rate the Fed is charging, they are not giving money to banks and then charging that rate of interest. And then the banks need to add on premium to that.
No, the borrowing and lending now is all in the Fed funds market. Not much at the Fed. You do occasionally hear about the Fed make some loans because we have some banks that get in trouble and no one wants to lend to a bank that might fail. Okay, you're gonna wonder.
Now it seems like they just consolidate with J.P. Morgan.
Yeah, and they can do so. The FDIC can come in too and arrange that sort of a thing. So anyway, it's the Fed funds market now. So there's a third rate I wasn't going to go into, but the third one is that the Fed since 2009 pays interest on reserves.
Okay.
So if you're one of those banks with extra reserves, the Fed is going to pay you a somewhat lower interest rate. Let's say 50 basis points below or 25 basis points. There is 100 basis points and 1 percentage point. So 25 basis points less than what you can get in the Fed funds market. So you're a bank with extra reserves. You would prefer to lend in the Fed funds market. But if nobody's borrowing, the Fed will pay you 25 points less.
And what's the logic there to encourage banks to hold a little bit of cash?
the Fed had tried for years to get Congress to allow, the Fed is a creature of Congress. Most people think they're independent, but it's not true. The Fed is a creature of Congress. Congress tells the Fed what to do. And the Fed wanted to pay interest on reserves for decades, I think. And the Congress said, no, we're not going to allow you to do that. Well, finally in 2009, Congress allowed them to do it. And the reason was because of quantitative easing. So we're going to go into a system, change from a system in which reserves are kept scarce to a system in which there are trillions of extra reserves.
Like, well, safety net of sorts?
No, it was misguided thinking, which we could go.
The government seems to do that a lot.
Well, and this is the Fed. These are people who are supposed to know banking and money and so on. Well, I thought quantitative easing was this huge stimulus thing, but it wasn't going to be a stimulus.
Well, because we've mentioned quantitative easing a lot of times, let's just go ahead and define that. Steve, do you know quantitative easing? Does that mean anything to you? All right. So maybe explain to us what that means.
Okay. So if we go back to 2007, 2008, people will remember we went into this terrible financial crisis where lots of the biggest banks were technically insolvent and should have been closed down. And I wish they would have been, but they weren't.
I would agree.
Instead, what we did was at first, Paulson was the Secretary of the Treasury. He got Congress to give, I think, about $800 billion, and he thought he could resolve the financial crisis with that. No way. We probably needed many trillions to do it. But Congress was not going to give any more than that. And at first, they actually said no. He said, hey, we won't have a financial system on Monday when banks open up. And they still told him no. But anyway, they came through with it. Well, it wasn't nearly enough. And so the Treasury said, Fed, this is up to you guys. And so what the Fed did was they dropped the interest rate down to zero. Okay, because that is how you're supposed to stimulate the economy. And if the economy recovers, the banks will recover too.
The idea is if there's no interest rate, money is sort of quote unquote free to go get. And if you want to buy a house, it literally will cost you nothing. You can.
Yeah. Well,
the bank might add something.
Yeah. You're not going to get the zero,
but you might get 2.
Yep. Well, people were getting definitely 3. You could get 3 after the COVID.
Yeah, I got 2.875 on my current mortgage.
There we go.
So my real estate agents are like, Alex, are you thinking about moving? I'm like, to where? Like, I buy the same house and it costs 2x, maybe even 2.5x.
So that's what happens when the Fed really lowers to zero. Then the rest of us get really nice low rates. Okay, but it wasn't working. The crisis
still was not stimulating what they needed.
And Treasury wasn't going to do anything. Congress finally did give Obama an $800 billion for fiscal policy. So we had first $800 billion to save the financial system, then $800 billion in a 2-year package to try to stimulate the economy.
Can we just clarify? So the $800 billion, you say in a fiscal package, $800 billion to try to stimulate the economy. The $800 billion in the fiscal package, where was that money going? Was it going directly to those businesses that were hurting and they say, we need some money, like we're going to literally go out of business unless we get cash?
Yeah, so this was government spending, and it's too long ago, I don't remember what it was, but that also was not nearly enough. But the problem was Congress wasn't in a mood to spend more. They were worried about the deficit. And President Obama went on TV, and you might have seen some of the clips, because they still float around, where he said, no, that wasn't enough money. We really want to spend more, but the government is out of money.
We're out.
So,
and Randy's going, no, you're not.
So anyway, they weren't going to spend any more. And so the poor Fed is sitting there and they're saying, okay, we went to zero. Okay. And
some places went,
give us more.
Some places went negative, correct?
In some countries, for technical reasons, we always economists always thought you can never go below zero, but for technical reasons you can.
So what does that fundamentally mean? They're charging banks to hold money? Is that what it is, sort of?
They could charge you to hold government bonds and require you to hold them.
Oh.
So you pay us an interest rate to hold the government's bonds, and you must hold them.
I was going to say, that sounds like a bad deal.
Yeah. So anyway, you can do things like that and get below zero. So anyway, the Bernanke had this idea, and he had been telling Japan to do this back in the early 90s, or maybe a little later in the 90s, because Japan's economy had been bad for a very long time. He had come up with this idea, well, the Fed can still do something. Even though Japan has zero interest rates, what the Fed can do, what the Bank of Japan can do, is quantitative easing. Use quantity, not price. The interest rate is a price. From zero, we're already there. Let's use quantity. Let's pump extra reserves into the system. Okay. If the banks have lots of excess reserves, then they'll increase their lending. So that was the idea. Mm-hmm. And I think he had something like the deposit multiplier in mind, because he's a very orthodox economist. He really believes those textbook stories. And he thought that this would encourage banks to lend, or at least that, look, if they've got trillions of yen of extra reserves on their balance sheets, and those reserves on the asset side of their balance sheet are earning zero, they need to get some earning assets.
Makes sense.
What they will do is make some loans to get some earning assets. Now, they couldn't do that because nobody wanted to borrow. Okay? You're in a very long-term stagnation. Firms didn't want to borrow. The firms were all accumulating savings. They weren't spending. And Japanese households were famous as savers, right? So they weren't going to spend. So it never worked. But anyway, Bernanke decided to try it in America. And if you're going to put a few $1 trillion of excess reserves into the banks, and those are non-earning, then our banks are going to be sitting there with zero earning assets, plus the big banks, lots of bad assets, right, whose values have fallen way below what they're carrying them on their books at.
This was essentially the financial crisis of 2008, is all these bad assets on banks' books.
That's right, bad mortgages and mortgage securities and so on. So anyway, so the Fed started buying government bonds. Okay. And pumping reserves into the system. Banks didn't increase lending. Then they also started buying and lending against mortgage-backed securities and other asset-backed securities. All these things created in that huge bubble from 2000 to 2007. And in those mortgages, probably, mortgage-backed securities, probably a lot of bad mortgages. The Fed's buying those too. And nobody really knew how much the Fed had done. Okay, we knew how much reserves had been put in the system.
Okay. So
we go maybe 5 trillion of reserve. $1 trillion is a lot.
Yeah.
Even for the United States.
Yeah. I don't even need $1 trillion. I need maybe just a half or a quarter and I'll be fine.
Okay. So trillions of reserves are put in the system. And, knowing that this is going to happen, they got Congress to change the law in 2009. Okay, now we're going to pay interest on reserves. So that helps resolve part of the problem. They're not earning zero. They're earning a little bit more. And so since 2009. But let me just finish with what the Fed did. Because nobody really knew. We knew there's a lot of reserves. What did the Fed buy? What's the total of the Fed's effort to try to rescue mainly Wall Street? Because the problem was in the big banks. Eventually, problems spread to small banks only because the economy was rotten. They weren't holding the bad stuff. It was the big banks that were holding the worst garbage assets. So nobody really knew. Congress asked the Fed, can you show us an accounting of what you guys did? Bernanke said, no, we're not going to do it. And so Bloomberg filed a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit against them and won. So the Fed started releasing the data. And various groups, Bloomberg went through it, and I think they came up with a number of 12 trillion. Bernie Sanders had a group do it, and I think they came up with 17 trillion. And then I was at UMKC at the time. We got a Ford Foundation project, and I put 2 students on it. And Nicola Matthews and Andy Felkerson. They got the raw data. It was 29,000 pages of raw data. They totaled it up, and it turned out to be $29 trillion. That's what the Fed did. That's what they spent and lent to bail out Wall Street.
So is my rudimentary understanding of this correct, that the Fed went in and bought bad assets from banks?
But now, here's the deal. We know the quantity, and every mortgage-backed security has a number code on it.
Okay.
But I cannot say for sure how much of those mortgages were bad. Okay, so they bought a lot.
But that's a really good headline. Come on. Fed buys junk assets from banks, right? That's what I had always sort of heard or understood, is that the bank that was holding all these, banks, plural, that were holding these negative, terrible assets, the Fed just went in and said, hey, we'll buy that off you at like a healthy value, right?
Yeah.
So maybe it's $1 million loan. It's really probably not worth that because you're not going to be able to collect that. Maybe it's worth half or a third. But they went in and said, okay, we'll give you $1 million in cash. We'll take that loan off your books. And that's fundamentally how they put that money into the economy, correct? And the banks.
And lending against it. So it's a combination of buying and lending against. Yeah. It was, now this project was 10 years ago. So my memory could be a bit off, but it's something like, really, it's 14 banks, and about a bit over half of those are American. So it wasn't just U.S. banks. It was also the big banks in Europe.
The Fed gave money to European banks.
They engaged in, the global monetary system is based on the dollar.
Okay.
And the global financial crisis was a global financial crisis.
Yep.
It turns out that, what we really learned from that crisis is that the Fed has to be lender of last resort to the whole world.
Whoa.
That's what we found. They also lent to central banks.
That would be so long as we want to retain the global reserve currency.
Yeah.
Which I guess makes sense, that if you want the privilege, you got to also it's like being a superhero, right?
Yeah.
Great power comes great responsibility.
I don't like a lot of the decisions made, but I think it would be a mistake to say the Fed should not have lent to the European Central Bank, the Central Bank of South Korea. They needed dollars, and they then could rescue their banks.
So when you say lending, when they're lending, fundamentally they are creating that money.
Yes.
That is a new creation of money.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting that it's going to European banks. So this brings me back to another one of the kind of, brain-breaking things that I heard you talk about, is that when the government collects tax revenue, it is not because they need it to spend on these various projects. Can you just detail fundamentally how that works?
Yep. Okay, if we look the way things work today in the United States, and
can I say one thing?
Yep.
It's very important that through this conversation, we remember this is the way that things are right now.
Yeah.
And I think I've heard you talk about a fixed versus floating rate currency. And if I'm understanding correctly, what you mean is a fixed rate currency like pegged to gold. Would that be reasonable?
And that would be a fixed.
So it's fixed. And then floating is our currency, which we know, just based on what we just said, we can create more currency. And I guess hypothetically, we can also take currency out of circulation.
We must.
Fundamentally, the things that you are saying right now all are related to our floating rate currency.
Yep. But also the UK, Mexico today, the European Union, ECB, the Euro system, the Japanese system. So it's not just the United States. Now we are in a somewhat different situation because our currency is the main international reserve currency, but it's not the only one. Even the Australian dollar is an international reserve currency. So there are a number of countries that issue currencies that are pretty much accepted all over the world, but the U.S. is the dominant one for now.
And is it fair to say that a lot of people and also economists, some of the ideas they have about how this works stem from that fixed rate currency? Like a lot of people are still kind of thinking about things in that regard.
Yeah, I think, and you see that in some of the criticism of modern money theory, MMT. And people are thinking along those lines and thinking that you can have an exchange rate constraint on your system, which we don't have because we don't try to fix our exchange rate. We let it
flow. Okay. So taxation.
Yep. So anyway, the way the system works today, and what I'm saying would apply to any of the countries that meet our definition of sovereign currency, is that the mechanics of spending are similar to what I was talking about with your bank. When the Treasury writes a check, let's say you're not on Social Security, but I am. When I get that Social Security check and deposit that in my bank, what happens is that my bank will credit my deposit account, of course. And then they send the check on to the Fed, and the Fed credits their bank reserves.
Okay.
That's how the Treasury spends. Those bank reserves are automatically created into the banking system when I receive the check and deposit it in my bank.
So it's not directly the Fed that created that, or they created it, gave it to the Treasury passed it on to you?
Well, the Treasurer signed his name on that check.
He says it's good.
They stamped it. Okay. They mailed out the check to me. As far as the Treasury is concerned, they have spent.
Okay.
But the spending is always done by the Fed. The Fed is the one that makes that payment for the Treasury, just like your bank makes a payment for you. You can't make the payment. The bank has to make the payment for you. How do you do that? Well, you send the check. Mm-hmm. Somebody gets your check. They deposit it. Your bank will debit your account, and their bank will credit their account.
The Fed is the bank of the Treasury.
That's right.
Actually, and they're the one who's creating I know the Fed, well, does the Fed store money? Do they have money stored? It starts at zero, and then it flips to whatever your Social Security payment is, $800 a month or something.
So the Fed's payment is in the form of Federal Reserve deposits. The bank has deposit accounts at the Fed, and all the banks have deposit accounts at the Fed. This is how they receive payments from the government. And that's how they make payments to each other. We already talked about that.
The bank has a bank account at the Fed.
Yep.
And it, even if it says zero, if at some point, then the Fed says, okay, you need some reserves because Randy needs his Social Security. I know the bank's not paying your Social Security, but maybe Randy needs to, go buy a flight. They can push that money into the individual bank's account, and then the individual bank can push it to you.
Well, they don't. Yeah. So
sorry, I know I'm getting into the weeds and I'm trying to clarify. I just want to make sure that I follow.
They can't push the money anywhere because all the money is a number on an account.
Yes.
Just like you can go into your bank account, you can use your computer and you can look at the screen and it has a number there. That's all it is. That's the only way that money exists.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And when you make a payment, you can watch, you can have your account open on your computer screen and suddenly the money's gone.
Yeah.
Where did it go?
That's the hacker, the South Park meme, and it's gone.
It's gone.
Yeah.
It doesn't go anywhere.
Okay.
What happened?
Right. Money has not physically it's not gold in a bank vault somewhere that someone has stolen.
That's right. Now, the one exception is that I received my Social Security check. My bank account is credited. I say, but, I want actual physical money.
Cash, baby.
So I go to the ATM machine. Okay. And so then it spits out Now, the money it spits out is also the Fed's liability, just like bank reserves are the Fed's liability. So
Cash is the Fed's liability.
So if you read your paper money, it says Federal Reserve note. So this is paper money issued by the Fed.
Which the idea was at one point when we were on gold, that note is a opportunity to redeem it for gold at a bank.
Well,
all right, now we're getting into some.
The Federal Reserve notes were not, even when we were on the gold standard. Americans could not hold gold, much less take the currency in and demand gold. So it's sort of a funny gold standard that we had. Only foreigners could get gold.
Oh.
Americans could not get it.
Well, I know gold was illegal at a point in time to actually hone and have.
From the Great Depression until, I think, under Nixon, it finally became legal to hold it. But they still weren't going to give you gold for your paper money.
Mm-hmm.
So we never could do that.
Okay, so back to the taxation.
Okay. So anyway, so we just went through what happens when the government spends. The Fed credits a bank's reserves. The bank credits your demand deposit.
Got it.
Now, what happens April 15 when you write the check to the Treasury?
My hand starts shaking uncontrollably, and my signature can hardly get onto the check.
Okay, so the Treasury receives that, and they send it to the Fed. The Fed will credit the Treasury's account. We'll come back to that.
Okay.
That is. But the Fed now is going to debit your bank's reserves, and your bank is going to debit your demand deposit. So
the amount of money in my account drops.
So government spending leads to a credit of reserves, credit to your account. Tax payments lead to a debit of reserves, debit to your account. Where does the money go? It just disappears.
Well, the Fed account is essentially at zero, you told me, right? So if I give them money, it's not going to go away from zero ostensibly because it never leaves the $0 amount balance. Am I kind of tracking that correctly?
The Fed is sitting there. It has a balance sheet, and on its asset side is those mortgage-backed securities they bought, government bonds. The Fed buys government bonds too, and the Fed makes loans of reserves to banks. That's on the Fed's asset side. Okay, although it's not making many loans today to banks as we went through. On its liability side are bank reserves. Bank reserves are a deposit account at the Fed. That is the Fed's liability. Okay? And the other liability is all of those Federal Reserve notes. Probably most of them are outside the United States. They're circulating the gun and drug trade. Okay? So all of those notes are also the Fed's liability. So when the Fed debits your bank's reserves when you paid taxes, the Fed's liability goes down. It's not that the Fed is getting money or anything like that. The money is the Fed's liability.
The cash that is outstanding in the system is their liability.
Yes.
So then when they get it back, it converts that liability. It's like fulfilling an IOU, essentially.
It comes back to that. When you write, I owe you a cup of sugar to your neighbor, okay? And then when you deliver that cup of sugar the next day and the neighbor gives you your IOU, what do you do with it?
You toss it in the trash. I don't need it anymore.
It's garbage now. What does the Fed do when it gets paper notes back or it debits reserves? It doesn't get anything that it can use. Okay? Now, it might stockpile the notes if they're still in good shape.
Do you mean the physical?
The physical notes. They might stockpile them, but they don't count as money for the Fed.
Can you even pay taxes in cash? Is that even a thing?
I always thought you couldn't, but there is some nut who does pay his taxes with a wheelbarrow and
pennies?
Pennies.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can.
I have that energy sometimes, Randy. I'm not
Give it a try. Let me know how it goes.
That sounds like more work than it's actually worth. I pay it online. I pay the EFTPS system.
But if we go back a couple hundred years, that is how most people paid their taxes. They used the in the old days, the U.S. didn't even have a Fed until 1913. So in the old days, all of the paper money came directly from the Treasury, and the Treasury actually would spend paper money. So if it hired you to dig a ditch, the Treasury would give you a stack of Treasury notes. Okay, and Treasury notes still exist, but they're like collector's items, and some of those are silver certificates.
Is that kind of like a check almost, essentially, from the Treasury?
It looks exactly like a Federal Reserve note, but it says Treasury on it.
You know, when you keep saying Federal Reserve note, it's like, you mean like a dollar bill?
Yeah, because the Treasury doesn't issue them anymore, but the Treasury did issue them. I'm not sure the date, 20s maybe. It was still issuing some. But before 1913, the notes had to come from the Treasury because we had no central bank. So the Treasury actually would spend Treasury notes. So you dig the ditch, Treasury gives you $10 of Treasury notes. Okay? And when you paid taxes, you would use the Treasury notes. So you would deliver, let's say, $10 of Treasury notes to pay your taxes. And at that point, when it comes back to the Treasury, it's no longer money. What does the Treasury do? Well, in the old days, they actually did physically burn it. If when the Treasury received notes, because what the purpose of the tax is not to get money to spend. There are two purposes of the tax. One is to get you to work for their money. Okay, you're not going to dig that ditch for 10 pieces of paper, okay, unless they're valuable. What makes them valuable? Well, you can pay your tax with them. If nothing else, you can pay your tax. Now, it could be that you'll also be able to buy groceries, maybe, depending on whether other people want them.
Mm-hmm.
Does the store want them too? Well, if everybody has to pay a tax, everybody's going to want some of these. So for shorthand, and this is a real simplification, okay? I'm not trying to be historically accurate, but we could say taxes drive money. If you have to pay taxes, that gives you at least one good reason to try to get the money, okay? And but once it comes back to the Treasury, it's not valuable anymore, okay? The thing that was of value is you dug the ditch. That's what they wanted. Treasury doesn't want the notes back, but they need to collect them back to make sure that you will work for them.
They also wanted to take money out of circulation, correct?
Because what if the Treasury says, tell you what, we're going to pay people to dig the ditches, but we're not going to accept them back in tax payment. Okay? It may be hard to get people to take them. And this was a chronic problem in history because the issuers, let's go back to the bad old days before democracy, kings often would refuse to take back their own currency.
And what would they want in exchange? Gold or something like that?
They'd
give you the funny money and expect gold?
They would even prefer to get foreign coins that had some precious metal in it because they could melt those down and make their own coins. Okay, so they would rather get that than their own paper money.
Do you understand why people would be freaked out at the idea that the government takes their taxes and burns them?
Yeah, because, we're saying the government doesn't really need your tax revenue.
Kind of sounds like they don't need my money. I should just keep it.
Yeah. But the problem is, if we don't get it out of the economy, it stays in the economy. And so it's adding demand to the economy. That could be too much demand, so it could lead to inflation. But the bigger problem is that we need the people to need the currency. And the easiest way to do that, and if you can think about a brand new country that has just been created and the government needs stuff done, they need some roads built and so on, they need the people to work to do that. How are they going to pay them?
I guess this all does sort of go back to enforcement and jail, and some of the more libertarians would say like guns, right? There's guns at the end of the day at this. Wouldn't I just, as the government, say, hey, it's legal that you have to accept my currency, you cannot do any other currency, and then I just skip the necessary to do this kind of like two-step process to get you to adopt my currency? Couldn't I just say Alex's currency is the only currency you're allowed? I mean, people have done this in religious regimes for a long time. You're only allowed to worship one God. Boom, solve the religion crisis, right?
So legal tender laws, and in the United States, our paper notes do say this note is legal tender for all purposes, public and private.
Yeah, when you go to that street vendor, they go, oh, sorry, we don't take cash.
Yep, that's right. So this guy, George Frederick Knapp, who created the state theory of money that has a big influence on us, says that legal tender laws are a pious hope.
A pious hope.
Because it requires, some force. Because how can the government be there in every single transaction and make sure that people will actually accept it? You could have, good incentives to not accept it. And, now the airlines don't want it. So it's a pious hope. It's very difficult to enforce. Kings were, fairly clever at finding ways. So one of their favorite ones, other than just killing you, their favorite one was, if you refuse to accept my coin, what we do is we get it red hot and we burn it into your forehead. So you can walk around the rest of your life as an example of what happens if you refuse my coins. But the reality is legal tender laws never were sufficient. And the best example of that was this guy named, first name John, if I remember right, John Law, who thought legal tender laws would be good enough. And so let's not bother with the taxes. And he
that's what I'm saying.
He issued tons of these notes.
Yeah.
And with legal tender law, but they collapsed because you can't stand there and enforce them.
Because it had no real value of any sort. It didn't have any teeth, essentially.
Yeah, and so there were debates. It went on for several hundred years. The people, say the advisors to the kings, and in the United States, we started off as a democracy. The people advising the treasuries, they understood the concept that you can use taxes to redeem the currency. And that's the term that they use. We go all the way back to the American colonies. They would authorize the colony government to issue, let's say, 10,000 Virginia pounds. This is before we broke away, so we still use the term of the British currency. The American colonies were not allowed to issue coins because the King of England wanted us to export to earn coins, because the whole idea of having a colony was produce stuff, sugar for rum, and tobacco and cotton to send to England. So they wanted us to ship what we produced to England, and in return we would get coins. But our colonial governments were always short. Coins were in a shortage. We didn't have nearly enough money.
And we weren't permitted to create or mint any of these coins.
King didn't want any competition.
Smart.
So the colonies had the bright idea of, paper money. Let's issue paper money. China had done it for hundreds of years, but this was the first big experiment in paper money in the West. And they would pass a redemption tax at the same time. So you can issue 10,000 pounds of Virginia notes, and we're imposing a new tax, a head tax or an import tax, usually, that is expected to raise 10,000 pounds. And then you can pay the tax with the notes. So they understood this perfectly well. And just the fact that they called it a redemption tax, they understood it's not to get money to spend. We're going to spend the money into the economy, but we need to get it back out of the economy. So you can redeem the currency in payment of tax. That's how we will get it out. And then we burn it, and they burned every one that they got. Now, why did they burn them? Well, it reduces fraud. What would happen if the tax collectors just filled their pockets and went out? You wouldn't get the currency out.
Tax collectors never had a good rap, did they? They didn't even like them in Jesus' time.
That's right. So anyway, redemption tax. And so this was understood. Adam Smith wrote about it in The Wealth of Nations. The strange thing going on in the colonies, even without promising to convert it to gold, these paper notes would keep their value as long as they didn't issue too much. Now, you got that last part wrong. the correct way to state it is, as long as they redeem them in taxes, get them out of the economy. He didn't maybe quite understand that, but other people did. And so there were debates. Is redemption alone enough? Is redemption required in order to get paper money to hold its value? As I said, so John Law said, we don't need the redemption. Legal tender laws. Well, no. It turns out you need the redemption to keep the value.
What would be other ways that we could have taken money out of the system? Other than taxes, now we live in a digital world. This is what some cryptos do. They burn tokens. They literally just go and delete the tokens.
Well, that would work, although you're going to get people pretty upset.
I'm already upset about my taxes, Randy. So
you'd be more upset if it was completely random. Yeah.
Well, I don't want it to be random. I want it to be, proportional is what.
Well, that's what a
tax is supposed to do.
That's what a proportional tax is. But anyway, it wasn't just taxes. Taxes are relatively recent. If you go back to the days of kings, usually it's fines and fees. And
those sound worse.
They're very clever at defining almost anything you do as illegal, so you have to pay a fine. Kill a deer. That's the whole Robin Hood story is about this. You kill a deer in the forest to feed your family. Well, you get fined if you do that. You cut down a tree, you get fined if you do that. So fines can drive currency too.
Interesting. So that kind of ties into the state theory of money. Yeah. Could you maybe just explain what I mean when I say that?
Yeah.
Explain to me what I mean when I say that.
So the state theory of money is that from the beginning you needed some kind of authority to come up with the money of account. So when we say dollar, we're using that in two senses of the term. So one is just a measuring unit. Okay, I can measure the value of virtually anything in terms of dollars. I think that chair is worth $10. Okay, I'm using it just as a measuring unit. It's like the inch or the foot. Okay, and then there also is the dollar.
The physical piece.
Yeah, and not all languages and countries use the same term for the same two things. We do, and that makes it very difficult. You see, in England, the pound is the measuring unit. The coin is the shilling. We never coin pounds.
And they call it quid. I don't even know what a quid is.
Neither do I.
Yeah.
So
anyway. Quid, mate. And I'm like, what is a quid? I don't understand.
So it gets confusing in the United States because we use the same term for two different things. If I say dollar, you don't know which one I mean. So I have to tell you, the dollar in your pocket.
I see.
Or the dollar unit of measure. Okay? So we will never know who came up with the idea of money as a measuring unit. It's extremely complex. If you think about it a while, how can you use, so inch is easy. I've got an inch right here. Okay. Well, they vary a little bit. Okay. But we get it.
But then we standardized it.
So standardization itself takes some kind of authority.
Right. That makes sense.
I'm not saying a dictator. I'm saying, a group got around the campfire.
It takes adoption.
Yeah. And say, we're going to do that because it wouldn't make sense if we all had a different inch. Okay. So we standardize it, but it's relatively easy. Humans probably came up with that tens of thousands of years ago. Okay. Weight units are extremely useful. Okay. The weight of barley grain or the volume of bushel.
Yeah.
So all human societies have these things. They can measure. But then when you start talking about, well, how can we measure a goat and a horse in the same measuring unit, or a goat and a basket of wheat in the same measuring unit? Conceptually, extremely difficult. We have some evidence.
Well, also even, sorry to interrupt, but even just one goat is not equal to one goat.
Well, that's true.
I have a prized goat, Randy, and yours is I don't know. It doesn't look quite as good.
But still, it's goats.
Yeah.
Your goat is 1.5 goats. My goat, 3/4 of a goat.
Yeah.
Okay. So we could still use goats, but going across and measuring lots of different things in the same unit is very, very difficult. So we get some evidence from writing. We can go back about 10,000 years through the history of writing. It's almost unbroken in Mesopotamia. And so when we look back at the most ancient things we can find, well, you can see scratches in rocks. Looks like maybe they're keeping track of something. Maybe they're counting, okay? And then a bit more complicated scratches in bones, maybe as much as 50,000 years ago.
I mean, counting seems to be like a relatively fundamental thing. That would make sense to me that you would see rudiment records, if we even want to call them those.
Yeah.
Because how many times did Randy go hunting for the deer? I don't remember. He says 8, but I only remember 5 or 6.
Okay. So they start doing that. And then what we find about 8,000 BC are these clay balls that have holes in them. And when you break the ball open, they have little tokens inside.
Oh, like a piggy bank.
And we can figure out what the tokens are because they sort of look like the thing they're representing. And so they are keeping track of things, a goat, a bushel of wheat, and so on. That's the earliest thing we've got. And then they figured out that instead of, and they probably put them in the ball for safekeeping so you don't lose some, and also they've got to be, if they have to be verified, you say, well, I've got 10 goats, 3 horses, and so on in here. You can break it open and see if that's true.
It was that was essentially like equivalent to the money. Like you traded someone this ball for their goat, and now like I have a goat that I can go and redeem with someone else. Sort of, is that kind of the idea?
Or it could be debts.
I see.
So we don't know. Okay. The next thing we see is they realize, well, you don't have to have a whole bunch of tokens and put them in a ball. You can press a token for a goat 3 times into a piece of clay. That's our first evidence of writing. Okay, so something that looks like a goat and a variety of other things. And then they realized that you don't have to use a token, you can use a stylus, and you make it look even nicer.
Yeah.
So they start using a stylus to keep track. And then gradually, about 3,500 years ago, that becomes the earliest cuneiform tablets. And we can read those. Okay,
this would be Egypt or
Mesopotamia. The longest records in Mesopotamia. So archaeologists actually can read them, and so we know what they are. They are recording debts. The first writing was by accountants, not poets. You don't start getting literary records
until you have a society that's developed enough where people can relax a little bit.
And I mean, the writing develops gradually with probably, some sort of science, and you have productive capacity, so you can have people specialize in science, in art, and so on.
Yeah, you're not foraging all day long, so you have a little bit of excess time to relax and go, yeah, I was thinking about these ideas, and maybe someone in the future could read these ideas. Well, I guess you wouldn't even have that verb yet, right? Maybe someone in the future could understand these ideas.
Yep. So anyway, and then a couple thousand years later, they get literary and they develop an alphabet. That's the first time that writing is like language. So these early tablets, the writing is not like language, okay? So then you can, of course, people told stories and they passed stories down. Now you pass the stories down written. So as best as we can determine, the notion of valuing things in a unit of account seems to have occurred in the temples in Mesopotamia. That seems to be the earliest evidence that we've been able to find of a money unit. And all the early money units came out of grain.
Okay.
So it would be the same term you use, let's say, for a bushel of wheat is your money unit that you use to value the goat, the horse, the cow.
So you'd say 1 bushel's a lot, but maybe if they were using something similar to like an ounce, 1 ounce of grain would be equivalent to, gosh, I don't know, 100th of a goat. So 100 ounces of grain equals 1 goat.
Yeah. So all those early terms like the shekel, those all, the pound, the lira,
right,
they're all weight units.
The pound is a weight unit.
Yes. So they all probably came out of the weight or volume units that humans have been using for a long time. They just borrow them. And then we know that what the temples would do is post price lists. So the price list tells you how many shekels each thing is worth.
And do you think those prices were market driven at that point in time? You think that they were implemented by a larger governing body?
The authorities put the prices on. And we know that these societies really didn't have local markets. What they did have long distance trade, and in long distance trade, for very, very long period of time until fairly recently, the prices are always negotiated.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Is what if I'm leaving that temple, I'm going to a faraway land, and I say, oh well, I should get 1 goat per 100 ounces, and they go, nah, buddy, not around here.
Yeah, so it would be negotiated between the authorities in each jurisdiction.
Oh, so you think so the authorities were, instead of just like, hey, dude, I don't care what the king says this is worth. You and I both know this is worth 100 ounces of grain.
The anthropologists and archaeologists who study this describe trade as being a lot like war.
Oh.
It requires lots of negotiation.
Interesting. And how fundamental is the state theory of money to modern monetary theory? Do you think it's super important, or do you think it's just an interesting side note?
Well, it's extremely important, and I mean, it's in many ways it's more of a description, because if I say that the typical case around the world today, and as far back as we can go in history, we have a 1 nation, 1 currency rule. That's a description. Okay, and that's exactly what the theory predicts, that the authorities choose the money of account, and that this is very important for a state to be able to choose its money of account, and then to for the state itself to issue currency denominated in that unit of account, and then collect back the taxes in that unit of account. So it becomes the measure of money value that all the monies in that society are going to conform to. So you can have lots of private issuers of money, and there always have been. There's always been private credit and debt. I mean, I shouldn't say always. 10,000 years ago, who knows? As you know, for the more recent past, the past several thousand years, you have private debt, you have private credit, but they almost always are denominated in that 1 money of account. Okay, the jurisdiction, the city-state or the nation-state will have its money of account.
So is this totally incongruent with the idea that the market emerged money kind of spontaneously? So you don't see a way that the market was sort of emerging money, this thing started to win out as the currency of account, and then governments went, ooh, I like that. Maybe I could use that.
No, I don't think so. You just don't find markets that are not based on money. So you've sort of got the cart and the horse there. You don't have any markets that then decide to create a money to facilitate. So the typical story that you read in chapter 2 of every textbook, which is completely wrong, is that first you had markets based on barter. And that it sort of makes sense. Okay, you got Robinson Crusoe, you got Friday. Robinson Crusoe
The island
knows how to
coconuts and
grow stuff. Friday knows how to fish. Friday has more fish than he wants, but he'd like to have some corn, so they barter. It just didn't happen.
You don't think that that's plausible?
Is it plausible in terms of a logical story? I suppose, but logic. The conclusions are always contained in the assumptions. Logic is not a way to discover reality. There's no historical record for this.
I guess the best counter argument that I've sort of heard is that by the time you get a government, you have like a pretty well-established group of people who are kind of functioning at some capacity. Wouldn't you say? Like, if I'm like, oh, okay, these like, whatever, 500 people, like, we're kind of like a functioning society. We need to govern this thing. By that point, wouldn't you think that there's some amount of trade going on that has facilitated growing our group of people to 300?
No. Look, tribal society has governance, but it is not civilized.
Okay.
It doesn't have a civil government. Tribal society can be very sophisticated, can produce lots of stuff, but they don't organize their economies around markets. They don't have money. They don't have prices. They do have exchange, but it's a very different kind of exchange. It's not like a market exchange. In market exchange, you're trying to get the best deal.
Mm-hmm.
In tribal society, exchange almost always is to equalize wealth. So if you've got more, you get the worst side of every trade, because the goal is to equalize, is to reproduce the society, is to bring people close together, completely different from a market. Now, there's some evidence that they would do something, sometimes it's called silent exchange, and some people will say that this is sort of a barter where you have two different tribes. And let's say you have one that lives on the coast and they know how to collect seashells and seafood, and the other lives interior and they grow corn or they have wood products, and they would do silent trade. So they would leave a pile of stuff, okay, that the seaside people would discover. And then they would leave a pile of stuff that the people who live in the woods. Okay, but there weren't really fixed exchange rates or anything like that. There weren't prices. There wasn't money. But, they were sort of redistributing the bounty that each had. And it could prevent war. It could get people to get along better. So you had that sort of thing going on. But within a tribal society, within your own tribe, you don't barter. You have gift exchange, like Christmas, like we have that custom, but you don't have markets. There's no need for them. Everyone contributes to society, and everybody is taken care of by society. Okay, you don't have individual responsibility to take care of yourself. In fact, in Margaret Mead is the mother of anthropology. She describes this particular tribal custom. And I don't remember the name of the tribe. If you kill a pig, you can't possibly eat any of that pig, and nobody in your immediate family can eat that. The uncle gets that. If I kill a pig, the uncle gets it. Why would they do that? Well, it's to keep people dependent on each other. Okay, so it's this idea we need mutual dependency and reciprocity.
I guess that makes sense when you have small groups of people, but I would think once you get past a certain level, you're always going to have some people who don't work necessarily as hard, right? And they're like, I don't kill as many pigs. So like, hey, it actually doesn't matter how many pigs I kill because everyone else is killing the pigs on my behalf. I would just think that as you get to a larger society, the level of trust that you need to have in everyone changes, I would think. Now, I don't know. And nor do, nobody's going to be able to go back 10,000 years and be the first ones.
But see, when I use the term civilized, I don't mean the people are nice. Okay, civilized people could be far, far worse. But civilized people came in contact with tribal society, so we know a lot about how they function. The Romans came in contact with the Germans. Germans were tribal society. Tacitus took notes on how they behaved. Columbus came to the New World. He came to tribal society. I just read Columbus's log from his first journey. This is the first time. Well, some Westerners had made it to the Americas, but he didn't know that. So, and these people had never seen Westerners before. So we know pretty much how they organize society. Some tribal societies are pretty big, but what they do is they divide up. So you've got a nation that is a group of a bunch of tribes. The Iroquois Nation, right, the best known American example, that have a bunch of tribes, and then those tribes are divided into gens. And so at the level of the gens, you're operating within your gens, and you're making decisions within your gens. So it's not like you've got thousands of people. Everyone is there at the campfire making the decisions, and they do appoint sachems and chiefs that are representative, but they still, all the things I'm talking about, all of the customs that they have for taking care of each other still exist in those. Now, tribal societies do break apart. Okay. And what's the island in the Caribbean that had already fallen apart before the Europeans came? Anyway, so and tribal societies had wars too with other tribes. So I'm not saying everything is hunky-dory and everybody is always getting along, but they create the institutions to try to get people to get along. Let me give you an example, and this is where I think money came from. Tribal societies, we know where civilized people have come into contact and taken the notes to see how they operate. They have this institution called Wehrgild. That's a German name because the Romans founded in the German society, but we have found it also in the Americas too. Wehrgild was this system of compensation. If I accidentally killed a member of your family, the arrow went the wrong direction or something, I would have to pay a fine to you. So these are Wehrgild fines. And we know that the fines are set in these public assemblies.
And this was even similar stories were in the Bible.
Right.
They actually had, I think, the monetary value assigned to if you kill your slave, you have to do X and Y and Z.
So there are the tribes in the Bible. So the Wehrgild fines are imposed on the family. You have to pay the victim of the family. So if you did it, your family has to pay the victim's family this fine. And they would have a list. They didn't have writing, so a list in their heads of what fine went with every possible infraction. And it's sort of funny because we know the Russian fine for cutting off someone's beard, you have a beard, was more severe than if you cut off their arm. So it sort of gives you an idea of what they valued too. But the fines were not in money terms. They were in items that were useful and readily available, because it wouldn't make sense to have fines and stuff that people couldn't get hold of, right? So it would be the pig, it would be the cow, or something like that. And these traditions persisted for down through society, and you've heard of one, bride price, where you have to, it's not that you're buying a bride, it's that you are paying a fine to the family that's losing a woman, okay, losing two hands who could help cook and so on. So you have to pay a bride price to the family. That's an example of a Wehrgild fine. So tribal society had no need for money because they didn't have markets, but they had need for debts, okay? Why did they do this? To prevent the Hatfield and McCoy blood feuds, because otherwise your family's going to retaliate against mine. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. So we create this institution of very guilt fines. So that was the purpose of that. So those are debts. Somehow, those debts eventually become monetized. Now, there would be no point in doing that in tribal society. But once you start getting the rise of an authority, so you're talking about somebody starts taking over, somebody gets to be above the others, they want part of that fine. Okay? And so the hypothesis by this guy named Philip Grierson, who was the world's authority on coins at University of Cambridge, came up with a hypothesis. It was fair guilt fines that became monetized with the rise of authorities.
Somebody needed a piece of it. Sort of like a tax, essentially.
That's right. So that's how they...
That would make sense if someone was almost like a judge in between, I would think. Mediators get paid a portion of the payouts, right? So if I'm the mediator between these two families, okay, this was the wrong, here's our standard judgment, here's what we're going to apply. I think that would make sense. I guess my only...
Just one thing.
Yeah.
Notice how we have changed this. Now, you don't have a debt to the victim. You have a debt to society, right? And so you pay a fine. Who do you pay it to? The government.
Yeah.
You kill someone, you have a debt to society. Do you compensate the victim? No.
Well, I guess it's civil cases, right?
Well, we have some, yes. But I'm just saying, well, this transformation became, it used to be probably the authorities only got a small share. Now the authorities get almost all. And yes.
I guess I would imagine still that markets within those tribes would emerge. Even if you cut my beard off, well, it should be whatever, 3 goats. Be like, that beard wasn't that great. Let's be real with each other. Like, that's a 2-goat beard, right? Or if you injure my brother, well, he wasn't that smart. Let's be real with ourselves, right? Come on, we're not going to do the full value of it. I would imagine that there's some negotiation. In my opinion, it doesn't really change the fundamental points of MMT that much, that the government is a sovereign group and they can create currency. The taxes are a unique thing that kind of flips our script in the way we think about those things. And then really, we haven't talked about this at all, but I would like to get into it, is inflation. Inflation is the big thing that it seems like MMT is. They do state very clearly that this is the thing we need to be worried about. But I'm interested, and I have a couple of questions for you about the last 5 years. So I'm interested to hear how your views about money and the economy have changed at all over the last 5 years. Because the big concern with MMT is we do have the ability to create currency. That's been established. That's factual. But the ramifications of that can and will be inflation. Over the last 5 years, I'm 32, but this is the most inflation that I feel like I've ever seen in my lifetime, certainly in my working lifetime. How do you kind of think about the last 5 years and what's sort of happened 4 or 5 years?
Well, I don't think it's changed anything with regard to the MMT concepts. So we've always said that, money doesn't cause inflation. Money is always innocent. Spending can cause inflation. Too much spending can cause inflation. And it could be argued that the second round of relief checks financed too much spending. So I think that's consistent with what we said, that you can spend too much. And, we've always argued, rather than having the CBO score the budget for what impact it might have on deficits, it should score the budget for the impact on inflation.
Okay.
And if they had been, I don't want to blame the CBO for the inflation, but maybe if they had been really focused on that second round of checks, they might have said, maybe this would be excessive. Now, MMT did not support either round. I argued against all of my progressive friends who thought I was a horrible person for arguing against the first round. And said, no, this is a crazy idea. Sending a check to anyone who has an address, that's crazy. Why would you do that?
Well,
I never lost a day at work.
I want to clarify, I did not get my check, Randy, so I'm still waiting on my checks because of the income thresholds as a business owner.
Okay. I got them, and I said, and of course I deposited them. I didn't run out and spend them, but I deposited them. But I said, why are you sending checks to people who have been impacted in an income way?
It's a helicopter drop. It's very rare that the government does that, right?
Yes. And with good reason. I don't think we should do it. MFT always argued for targeted spending.
Okay.
So we argued for targeted spending at that point. And if you want to make sure I'm telling you the truth, you can go to the Levy Institute and you can see our proposal before that first round was sent out. So we said target it to the people who lost their job. Okay, target it to employers who will keep people on the payroll. Okay, that was all perfectly sensible.
We did have our PPP, but unfortunately that I think now they know is one of the single largest fraud events in history.
Okay, you have to avoid fraud.
Yes.
But anyway, so probably the second round, the first round got saved. So as it turned out, I was worrying too much about the first round because people rationally saved.
How much was the total amount? Do you have any idea of the total amount?
$5 trillion.
Just in one check in the first round?
No, first round 2.5, and then that. So Trump is 2.5, Biden is 2.5.
But that doesn't sound so bad when we look at what they did in 2008, right? I mean, if you said it was 28, 29.
That's different. That was not
right.
That was not spending into the economy. That was the Fed buying up maybe trashy assets. That money didn't really get into the economy.
Because it goes to the bank's reserves, and then there's no guarantee. The banks are not going out and buying themselves yachts with that.
No.
Okay.
That would be illegal. Not to say that bankers don't do that sort of thing, but that would be illegal.
Okay. So the $5 trillion and the 28, 29 trillion are not created equally, essentially, is what you're telling me.
Yes. Completely different. Yeah, so it's good you brought that up. The Fed did not spend any of that money into the economy. It stayed locked up on the Fed's balance sheet. Okay, so banks had a credit at the Fed's balance sheet, but it never went anywhere. Okay, and the Fed tried quantitative tightening, which was to take the reserves out, but every time it did, the banks threw a sissy fit.
What does that mean? They take money away from the banks' reserves?
They tried to sell the bonds back into the banking system and take the reserves out. So that was quantitative tightening. They did some, but they wanted to do a lot more, but the banks threw a fit. And so they still have lots of excess reserves.
Interesting. So is that what you think is the primary driver of the inflation over the last 4 or 5 years?
I think that it had some impact. I think that the majority of what went on was supply chain disruptions, and then those feed through. If you have supply chain disruption on inputs to the production process, they start feeding through, and it takes a long time for that to work itself out. I think that I know price gouging is in the media today right now. There's a lot of price gouging going on too. The markups increased a lot. I don't think it's really the grocery stores. So I think they're hitting in the wrong spot.
Yeah, I think I just saw this morning that I think Harris, it's not Harris, Biden any longer. I think Harris was saying that if she becomes president, she'll do something with like restricting the price of food. And I was like, how's that going?
Well, I'm not opposed to trying to do something, but I think aiming it at the grocery stores where the markup is pretty low, is the wrong spot.
Yeah, I have friends.
General Mills may be where you want to target, not grocery store.
Yeah, my friends in the grocery industry, they don't sing about it and say, "Boy, we're rolling in the cash over here." It's tough. I mean, there's a lot of tough businesses out there, but that is one of them.
Yes.
So if you were, I don't want to say Fed chair, but if you were in control of the whole system throughout, let's say 2020 to 2024. We can take lockdowns out of it because we're just asking about monetary policy. Although I think obviously that had an impact.
Yes.
What would you have done differently to attempt to create a better solution through these last 4 or 5 years?
I wouldn't have increased interest rates. I would have kept them low.
Okay.
I would. The Fed was patient a long time. That was the right policy, and Powell was very reasonable. I was really shocked at how reasonable he was and how patient he was for as long as he could. And then there was so much pressure on him
because of the inflation in the market
from orthodox economists who believe that raising interest rates will reduce inflation. It will not. It does not work. Okay, the whole thing is based on the idea that spending is interest sensitive, but most spending is not. Okay,
I would agree most spending is not, but certainly some is.
Some is, but
cars, houses.
But look, we had a problem in cars. That was supply chain problems. Okay, and so there weren't cars to buy, and keeping rates low so people could buy cars made no sense, of course. But you knew that we were going to overcome that supply chain problem. It would take a while. Car prices were going to be high for a while. There wasn't much that could be done about that. The energy prices, well, it happened that a bunch of refineries were offline.
And people were off home running their TVs all day. That also, I think.
Yeah, so maybe an increase in demand for a variety of kinds of energy. Biden released some oil reserves. That was a good policy. You know, why keep the oil in the ground? Let's get some out and help relieve prices. But oil prices, you know, they go up, they go down. They are not impacted by the interest rate. People are not stopped going to the gas station to get the gasoline they need to drive to work because the interest rate is high. Doesn't work. Okay. Housing. Okay. We had and have a massive shortage of housing in the United States. The number of houses built is a record low since the global financial crisis. We never recovered the housing market from the global financial crisis, which is why house prices were rising. Okay, and so people say, "Oh, the housing market is great." Why is it great? There's not enough houses. So raising interest rates makes construction so much more expensive because it's a long-term process. You got to carry debt for a long time. It becomes too expensive to build houses. So if anything, that makes housing worse. And shelter is 40% of the CPI, more or less. It goes up and down over the time. It's about 40% of the CPI. And right now, that is the source of our inflation. It's shelter. The shelter component is a bizarre thing. So it's not really, related to new homes at all. It is the rental component and the imputed rent. The joy you get from being a homeowner is included in the CPI. There is no real spending there at all. So the homeowner occupied housing component of shelter, which is the biggest one because America is a country of homeowners, is a purely fictitious number that drives the CPI. And that is what is high now.
Well, I know there's a lot of concerns with CPI in general. People say that it's kind of like a made-up system and there's some weird quirks in it, like substitution goods and things like that. I don't know all the intricacies, but I know that people say it's been changed multiple times. So there was a certain way it was in the 80s and 90s. Now there's a certain way that it is now. And what I have heard is they're kind of trying to back engineer it to get to 2. It's like either it wasn't 2 back here or it's not 2 right here. I don't care which one it is, but both of them cannot be 2% because you've changed the goal. You've moved the goalpost.
All indexes, including price indices, are human creations. They're all, and the CPI is full of imputed things that are not market prices at all. In many ways, they've made it worse. In some ways, they made it better. They used to include the interest payments in the CPI. So every time the Fed raised the interest rate, the CPI went up. So they're fighting inflation that they create by raising the interest rate because home mortgage interest was included in the CPI. They took that out in the 80s, so we don't do it that way anymore.
I heard Warren Mosler say that he advocates for a 0% interest rate.
Yeah.
Like across the board. Is that something you also advocate for? And also, I'm not sure I totally follow what that would look like. Would that just mean that the banks essentially get to set their rates and they kind of fall into a market after the Fed sets that zero? Maybe you want to talk me through that?
Okay. No, so he's only talking about the Fed's interest rate being zero. Yeah. Now, if the Fed's interest rate is zero, so this is the Fed funds rate target.
The
Fed, remember,
we talked about
set that,
right,
but it targets it.
And then the banks go, it's kind of like when the stock analysts say, our target for Amazon is $190. And that sort of like moves the market upwards. Am I accurate in saying that?
Except that it's even more controllable because the stupidest bet you can make is to bet against the Fed because the Fed can do it. The Fed can make it zero.
Okay.
All they have to do is stop paying interest on reserves and a system full of excess reserves.
I see. So they can kind of rig the game to get to that.
So they're going to get the rate they want. Okay. It will fluctuate in a band at 25 basis points. So that's what it means. It doesn't mean that your bank loan is going to be zero because you're a risk credit.
Right. That was what the argument was, and I wasn't quite understanding if it was zero, then how is risk ever built in? Like, why wouldn't I?
The only one who will get zero is the Treasury on 3-month bills because those track the Fed funds rate. So the Treasury would get the zero, but nobody else is going to get zero.
So if the Fed's goal rate is zero, you're still not saying that banks could go out. I mean, they could go out and charge 5%, but
if they need to, but
they're probably going to get undercut by other banks.
Right. They compete with each other. And it's not perfectly competitive. So there can be collusion. They have been known to rig rates to work with each other. But definitely, if the Fed's target is zero, all the other rates are going to come down commensurately. So you could expect going from 4 to 0 in the Fed's target, you're going to be reducing other rates by up to 4 percentage points.
So we do all this discussion about the things that the Fed does and the things that the Treasury does and their decisions that they make. I guess one of my fundamental questions is, how involved do we actually need these bodies to be? Like, are they just so involved? I kind of think of it like an overbearing doctor, that it's like you got hip pain, so I give you like a shoe insert, and now, I got a little bit of knee pain. Okay, so then I come in here and I do a little knee scope for you. And now because of that knee scope, you can't run on that, so now your left knee starts hurting a little bit, and we go in there and we give you a knee brace on that one, and now your left ankle's kind of starting to hurt a little bit. And so we go in there and we do like a little, laser etching on your knee. It's just like, wait a minute. Could we have just stopped back at the beginning and been like, that hip pain's going to alleviate itself. It's going to hurt for a little while, Randy, but it's not a big deal. Am I tracking right, or am I oversimplifying things?
It's even much worse than that because doctors actually know something about their profession. They know something.
This is a bad one. He got his license, and I actually have a buddy who went to medical school in St. Kitts. So, and I'm sure he's pretty smart. He still got his medical license, but it wasn't from Harvard.
Okay. Anyway, so the problem with the Fed is they do not understand the way the system works. And I know that sounds very arrogant to say, why do I think I know more than they do? They come at it from a complete orthodox perspective based on neoclassical theory, and it's just completely wrong. So again, they think raising interest rates is going to slow the economy, increase unemployment, and that is going to bring down inflation. Okay, so they don't like to highlight this, but they want people to lose their jobs.
Well, that's what they keep talking about. The unemployment is too low. And I'm like,
we want to take your job away from you. And if we can get enough people to lose their jobs so that they can't go buy food and clothing and shelter and they end up homeless, we might be able to get that inflation rate down. So that's the theory, okay? And we're going to do that by raising interest rates. But again, going back, there not much spending is interest sensitive. On the other hand, interest is a cost of doing business. And so what you just did was you increased business costs. If you take a restaurant example, biggest cost probably is interest. And unlike 30-year home mortgages, most businesses don't have 30-year fixed rates. So
correct. And that's a very important point that a lot of people don't realize.
So they're going to start feeling it pretty quickly. And you're going to feel it with your commercial bank, your payroll. You're going to feel it immediately because you're borrowing every 30 days. So business costs go up. What do businesses do when their costs go up? If I have a room of 100 economists and I ask them, what happens if wages go up? 100 hands. Prices go up. If I ask, what happens if oil prices go up? 100 hands. What happens if rent goes up? 100 hands. What happens if interest rates go up? They'll say, oh, prices go down. How could that be?
They're assuming that the spending will slow and that there's business will like reverse course and be like, hey, we're not selling enough. Let's drop our prices. Is that kind of the idea?
But there's no evidence for this. And I'm telling you, literally, I look at the literature, the economic literature. They try estimating what's called the interest elasticity of spending, and you don't find any. You do not find it.
The interest elasticity of spending.
So how responsive is spending to interest rates? So yes, you can name a few things that will have a response. So you will stop borrowing to buy that thing. But for the most part, so if you take the whole economy, nope, you don't find it. You do not find spending declining because interest rates went up. So I think the way interest rates actually work, and I think the evidence is there to support this, is interest rates work if you can cause a sufficiently significant financial crisis. That's what Volcker did. So Volcker, who was the chair Fed from 1979, who pushed interest rates above 20%, so it was much higher. But Volcker is Powell's hero because Volcker supposedly broke this high inflation that we had. I'm a lot older than you. Back in 79, that lost Carter the presidency and brought in Reagan. Carter was the one who brought in Volcker because they had run out of ideas. How are we going to do it? Volcker said, "Well, I'm going to follow Milton Friedman, who says you need to tighten the money supply." So he pushed interest rates above 20%. We got a tremendous financial crisis. Half of all the savings and loans failed in the United States because of that. And all of our big banks were insolvent by the end of the 80s. We got a deep recession, our deepest recession since the Great Depression. And inflation did eventually come down, but we had a tremendous financial crisis. And then if you look at what actually caused the inflation, it wasn't that we had too much spending. We had high unemployment. Okay. We had what was called stagflation through the 70s, which was high inflation, high unemployment at the same time. Our inflation was not because of too much spending. It was because we had two OPEC oil price hikes, quadrupled the price of oil. And then oil feeds through really quickly to food because food is 70% oil because of the way we produce food.
Right.
Produce it and transport and process it. And then the third was shelter, the item I was talking about earlier.
Because the interest cranks up?
Well, that was part of it, that at that time it fed through into shelter. But if you look at 1974, if you look at 1979, if you look at 2004, if you look at our past high inflation, those are the three items that always drive inflation. It is always oil, food, and shelter. Okay? And the interest rate doesn't work on those things.
So I think a senator just proposed, and I think Rand Paul's been talking about this for a long time, let's get rid of the Fed. What would life look like if there was no Fed? Why do I even need this Fed? You just talked about how crap they are at this job for 10 minutes. What happens if we just get rid of the Fed? We don't need this. Like, let's just let the free market kind of pick the solutions.
Okay, I think that people are upset about two things. So people old enough to remember the global financial crisis and what the Fed did to bail out Wall Street, and that probably includes Paul, because I think he really opposed the bailout as much as I did, coming from completely different perspectives.
Yeah.
But, obviously this was not a free market solution.
No.
Fed bailing out banks that the market wanted to shut down.
Yeah, it was socializing the losses and privatizing the gains.
Okay. So I think the two things the Fed does, one was that bailout of Wall Street, and they just bailed out the second, third, and fourth biggest failing banks in U.S. history. What was it, a year ago? Okay.
Silicon Valley, and I don't know about the other ones.
SVB and the other two. I've forgotten their names. So anyway, that, and the other thing that they hate, including Trump, is raising the interest rate. And Trump says he's going to take that away.
Okay.
Good.
Take away what? The ability to change the rate?
Yeah, I don't believe the Fed should be allowed to change rates. I think the rate should be set by Congress. I'm not completely on board with zero. I don't think it has to be zero.
Okay.
The Fed is a creature of Congress. When any of the chairs go to the Fed, now Powell has had pretty good relationship with the Congress. I meant go to the Congress. The Fed chairman has to go to Congress and take questions and abuse.
Those are, pretty much they just get bitched at for 6 hours.
Okay. So, but Powell has been on pretty good terms with them compared to the previous two. But Bernanke used to say, because they're all attacking him, he says, look, if you don't like what the Fed is doing, just tell us what to do.
Okay.
Because this is perfectly within the purview of Congress. The Fed is a creature of Congress. Congress can say, from now on, the interest rate is going to be 1%. We did that in World War II. Congress told the Fed what the interest rate would be to fight the war with a low interest rate.
So if Congress can tell the Fed what rate to set, again, why can't we get rid of Fed and then either Congress, I would prefer more of a free market approach. Again,
The market can't set the base rate. That's the problem. The market has to price off something. And so we could have the Treasury issuing bonds and saying, okay, the interest rate on this bond is going to be 3%. So then we could price off that. We need something to price from. But anyway, so those are two things the Fed should not do. The Fed does other things, okay? The Fed operates a clearing mechanism. Now, there are private clearing mechanisms, and then there's the Fed. The Fed is the ultimate clearer. It's the ultimate lender of last resort. It is the one that has to do the opposite of what the market does in a crisis. In a market, what the market tells you to do is sell.
Mm-hmm.
Sell everything.
Yeah.
Sell before it goes even further down in price. What the Fed does is says, I will buy. The private markets will not do that. And so we've known this since the 1840s. The idea that the Bank of England used to do what the market did. So the Bank of England was sort of their central bank, but it didn't act like a central bank. It acted like a private bank because it was a private bank. It wasn't part of the government. And when everybody else is selling, the Bank of England sold too, and they made the crisis worse.
Yeah, right. I was going to say, that seems like, oh, shoot, the Bank of England's selling? I better get out. What do they know that I don't know?
So anyway, they figured out the Fed has to, any central bank, including the Fed, has to operate in the opposite direction. They have to be the lender of last resort. This is the most important function of the central bank. It's how we prevent Great Depressions. The U.S. we created the Fed in 1913 because of the 1907 financial crisis. What happened was everybody's selling. We had no central bank. Okay, other countries had central banks, and they knew what to do, but we didn't have one to do it. So what happened was J.P. Morgan called all the New York bankers into his big room, had somebody lock the door, and he said, nobody's leaving this room until all of you agree that you're going to chip in and buy, okay? And then the next thing they did was they told Congress, you must create a central bank because we're not going to do this again. So the Fed was created in 1913 to be a lender of last resort. And then it's the very first crisis we had was the 1930s, and the Fed did not solve the problem. So the Fed continually fails. It sort of screws up. It doesn't do a great job, but it's better than nothing. And every time it fails, we give it more responsibility. It always fails upward.
Yeah. Again, that's sort of my point. Like, how much can we delete? Like, I just want to remove as much power as I possibly can from these organizations, because I'm back to my doctor example. It just feels like every step they take, it just makes it slightly worse. Or, and I think this is what, maybe libertarians or more people on the different side of the economic aisle would say is, you're just kicking the can down the road, and you're going to make this bust even worse at some point in the future because you're not really letting the market correct itself. So that's kind of the argument that I've heard, is that you have this .com burst and you sort of like come in and save it, and then you're creating 2008's burst and you're coming in and you're saving it, and then 2020 COVID, sort of like a mini one. Maybe it was a recession, maybe it wasn't, I don't know. And then you come in and you save it, and then it's like, are we just pushing this down the road until one day we just have a total explosion?
Well,
and the pain is really bad at that point.
There's lots of truth in what you're saying. And next we could talk about Hyman Minsky, my professor, who has this whole theory of this. So, yes, the problem is the alternative is worse.
You think so?
Yes. If you look at U.S. history, we had by far the worst financial history of any of the countries that became rich countries. By far the worst, because we had no central bank. We had a depression every generation. So Americans only remember the last one, 1930s, the Great Depression. But we had a depression every generation that was always caused by a financial crisis.
Do you think that is a function of the U.S. just being a bit extreme? I was just talking about this. I've talked about this twice this week alone. The kind of the comparison that I feel between the U.S. and maybe some other countries is we go extreme with everything, man. Like, if you're a capitalist, like, I want to be a billionaire. If you are into coffee, I'm going to open a coffee shop. We're going to import and just like, we're extreme about everything. I just kind of wonder out loud, are those recessions worse because we're pushing the financial kind of game as far as it can go, which also has clearly led to prosperity. I mean, we have the largest GDP of anyone in the world by a decent amount, I think. So is it just that we're going to have these boom busts naturally? It seems like you have boom busts no matter what, whether you have a central bank or not.
We have recessions, though, not depressions.
Okay.
If you compare before the Fed, after the Fed, we only had one depression, and the Fed could have done a better job in that case. Our growth is much more steady.
Okay.
So we still get the booms, you're right, and we still get the recession, you're right, but they're not as deep. They're not nearly as deep. So the overall economic growth on average is much better than it used to be. Now, that said, this worry that by preventing the really bad depressions and never really cleaning your system out, propping up these bad ideas, badly run banks and so on, the crises could get worse with each subsequent one. And that, I think, is actually reality. The crises have been getting worse. We had no financial crises from World War II until 1966, and that one was very minor. Then we had another in 1970, a little bit worse. We had them in 1974, a little bit worse. We had them in the 80s. As I said, half of the savings and loans failed. Worse. Global financial crisis, a lot worse. COVID is an unusual thing, so I don't want to include it in that.
But might have been kind of ready. It didn't matter what was going to happen. It might have been ready.
Something. And I think something is going to happen in the next few years. So Hyman Minsky, who was my professor, came up with this idea, the financial instability hypothesis. In the 1950s, he predicted this is exactly what would happen. And because we have the Fed that is a lender of last resort, we prevent the depression, so we don't clean the system out. And so the instability, potential instability grows, the fragility of the economy gets worse and worse. The financial institutions are encouraged to take more and more risk, to increase leverage ratios. All this stuff turned out to be true. Okay, so I'm not disagreeing with you.
Did Hyman want to get rid of the Fed?
He wanted to change the way the Fed operated.
Okay.
He wanted the Fed not to go into the market and buy stuff like the Fed has been doing since 1960. He wanted the Fed only to lend at the discount window. And as a quid pro quo, if we lend to you, we get to look at everything in your books. And if you're doing stuff we don't like,
Interesting.
we're going to force you to stop. So that would be an additional looking over the shoulder of all the banks. And you know that a bank that is coming to the Fed must have some trouble because they can't borrow reserves from other banks. So you take that opportunity to try to change their behavior. Now, the FDIC is also supposed to be looking over their shoulders, and the FDIC does a good job with small banks. It does a terrible job with the big banks. And so you need an additional pair of eyes looking at them, but probably we also have to get rid of the big banks.
Well, also 2008, they put legislation in place to try to protect us, right, from the banks, and all Dodd-Frank did was consolidate things. Now J.P. Morgan and U.S. Bank and Bank of America and Wells Fargo, like they bought up all the small little community banks.
Yes. And they were not prosecuted. The savings and loan, if I remember right, my colleague Bill Black at UMKC wrote the book, The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. He was at the FDIC going after these criminals after the saving and loan crisis. They put 1,000 top management in prison. In the global financial crisis, he and I, during the bailout and looking at all the crime that was committed by the top banks, nobody went to prison. A vice president of Bank of America, who we had singled out, was convicted.
That poor guy's just so mad, right?
It was a woman. And it was funny because...
Sorry. Women can also commit crimes.
We were writing about her in the Huffington Post, and she responded to us.
Oh.
Just,
From the jail cell?
No, before she got convicted. No, it's all false. And then she got convicted. But unfortunately, she got off. It got overturned. So nobody. And the crimes were more sophisticated, but much more damaging than the crimes during the saving and loan crisis. And the consequences for the economy and for homeowners who had been just screwed by the lenders into mortgages they couldn't possibly afford and couldn't understand, and were fraudulent loans. So anyway, that is a big problem.
In part of the repercussions, I mean, obviously there's criminal repercussions, but part of the repercussions I feel like I would have liked to have seen. Looking back now, I was pretty young when it all happened, but you just need those businesses to fail. When you engage in inherently really risky behavior. You need to get slapped on the wrist. And if we don't actually make that happen for those banks, it's kind of like, I mean, look at Silicon Valley Bank. They got bought by Chase. And I don't know if it was a profitable endeavor for them, but they certainly didn't suffer the consequences. They certainly didn't have to pay back shareholders through their next 10 years of jobs, like most Americans would have had they lost a bunch of money for someone else.
Yeah. Well, banks are a bit different because, they're holding people's wealth, and you probably don't mind so much for the shareholders to lose, but you wouldn't want your deposits to go bad. Now I know we've got FDIC insurance, and if you don't want to take any risk at all, you make sure that all of your funds in the banks are FDIC insured, and
pretty much all of them are.
That's very prudent, but they weren't back then. We used to have 40,000 limit, and then 250, and then finally, oh well, we'll insure them all because otherwise Silicon Valley is going to be in big trouble. So anyway, you letting uninsured depositors lose is politically difficult and maybe not good policy, because there's lots of incentive problems why it is that people will take the risk with uninsured deposits is a bit of a problem.
Well, I guess I've heard people make the case that if we removed that FDIC insurance, then people would have to actually pay attention to the bank they use.
Yeah, but think about that. Okay, so I know this is a proposal, and it was a proposal in the early 90s. We had a conference at the Levy Institute where we brought in people making that argument. So this is even before the global financial crisis, but we had the saving loan crisis. Well, that wouldn't have happened if the depositors were the supervisors of their banks.
Okay.
Now think about that. Okay, so I've got Chase. I'm going to go into Chase. I'm going to demand to see their books. Now, I'm an economist. I know more than most people do, but I can tell you there is no way on earth I could evaluate Chase's balance sheet, nor can they show it to me.
Well, I guess
just remember, they cannot show you that data. There is no way you can get at the data because it's confidential.
Well, they're publicly traded companies, so there's some amount of data that's given out. But here's what I would envision. Maybe this is crazy. Kind of like the credit bureaus. The credit bureaus, they're just a created thing, and then they'll
disaster.
I agree. They're not good. So it's not the perfect example, but I think that if it was more consumer face, it's like the Better Business Bureau, which I also take offense to. Doesn't matter. I imagine there's some bank rating board out there, or even just, private YouTubers who are out there and they're saying, hey, I'm looking at this bank. I'm checking out what they're presenting to us. And you know what? It does look really, really solid. And then maybe Chase goes, forget you guys. We're not going to give you any of our information. I think the market would make a decision and be like, if Chase is not going to give us their info, then forget these guys. And then maybe it almost becomes like a thing that, hey, if you want to compete, you have to present your balance sheet. We have a license for being a doctor, but to be a professional doctor, you have to have your license, and you put it on the wall. And then when I walk in, I go, oh, okay, my friend went to St. Kitts. I've never heard of that college, but I'll still enjoy my time here. That's kind of maybe the way that I would envision it happening. I'm not saying it's perfect, but again, my lens of many things is just trying to get the government out in many ways, because, and this is a question that I have for you, I don't feel like they're super good at partitioning resources. I don't feel like they're very efficient at partitioning resources. And I know under modern monetary theory, that's a big thing. You say like, hey, we can just create the dollars to go out and spend. In the documentary, it was under the Green New Deal, but it doesn't matter. Insert whatever thing you're interested in here. I guess my concern would be, if the government has not historically presented, to me at least, that they're fantastic at partitioning resources, are we giving them even more power and saying like, you guys, not only are you not constrained by a budget, but you don't have any constraint on your spending. Just go for it.
Well, hold it. They're constrained by a budget, the budgeting process.
The Congress setting the budget, but it's still a creation that we are not going to run out of money if we go over our budget.
Oh, they can't go over the budget. So the budget constrains every individual program. So you have an allocation. You can spend up to the budget. Okay, we're not talking about getting rid of that at all. That's the only thing that really constrains the spending.
Right.
Okay. So if Congress allocates to the various parts of the overall budget, what we advocate is, first you need to have a good plan of what you're trying to do. You have to have competence and prevent fraud. All of those things are extremely important. And in addition, you have to consider the inflationary impacts, which means you've got to look at the resource demands, where those resources will come from, and weigh the private versus public question, because if they're already employed, you're going to be taking them away for some other purpose. So all of those things in a democracy, those things are done by our elected representatives. So that tells us what we can do. I think there are things the private sector does well that shouldn't be done by the government. There are things that the private sector needs support for, may need infrastructure in order to do that. But still left to the private sector. But what the public sector is doing is spending to help provide what the private sector needs in order to do what they're going to do. And then finally, there are areas where the private sector is not going to be particularly good. Now, you may hire the private sector to put in public infrastructure that is needed. For a long period, we were building dams. And, the government didn't really build the dams, but they were involved in the planning and they funded them. So those are public projects. But the government as an employer is extremely small. It doesn't do much of anything at all. It's mostly hiring the private sector to do those things.
Right.
And then finally, there are things the government does with its own employees, which is relatively small. The U.S. as a whole is a very small government economy. I know Americans don't know this or don't believe it, but if you look around the world, we're at the very low end of the spectrum for the size of the national government relative to the size of the economy.
You mean like a percentage of people that are employed by the government?
No, very small on that.
Like isn't Canada like 40% or something very high? And then I think France is also super high.
So employees, but I was saying in terms of GDP.
Okay.
So in terms of the spending, the federal government is 20% of the economy. We're like Japan. We're in that range. Mexico's 13%. So Mexico's even smaller than ours. I would say we have much better outcomes than Mexico. I think their government's too small. But France is like 50%. So we have a small government economy. And we have a relatively decentralized, because state and local governments do much of what you see every day isn't the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
It's the state and local governments and school districts and things like that. Where in other countries, the national government would do those sorts of things.
That's interesting. I do wonder about how modern monetary theory would just not incentivize the government to spend, but it does feel like it gives them a little more like, okay, we can spend. We're not worried as much about expanding the national debt, because that's the part of the big point of that documentary is the debt is not as big of a concern as I think everyone believes it to be. Am I fair in saying that?
Yes, and the documentary is really focused.
And I know you didn't produce the documentary.
Yeah.
This is not everything, but you're featured, and you did a great job, and that's why I contacted you.
And I consulted a lot. The documentary's its main focus for expanding the government is in tackling climate catastrophe. Now, if you look at the challenges we face with climate and the Earth's capacity to absorb our waste, carbon is one of them, but we have lots of other kinds of waste that we're putting in, and the tipping points that we're reaching. This is not something the private sector can take care of. In a sense, the private sector created these problems.
I would agree.
Now, with government encouragement and a lot of those things,
Mm-hmm.
okay, but the private sector can't handle it because it's within the purview of any particular firm. Even if a firm with 100% completely sustainable, one firm, it's not going to make any difference at all.
Mm-hmm.
20 biggest firms in America, still not going to make any difference at all. And it requires, say, we have to completely redo our whole electrical grid. That requires central planning. I know that planning is a bad word. It requires central planning. It can't just be the United States.
Right.
Even if the United States went completely sustainable, if China doesn't, and if all the emerging nations in Africa and South America, which right now are not adding much at all to the problem, but they will, because they're going to develop. So in other words, it requires international cooperation, working together to solve these problems. Poor developing countries cannot produce their own solar power. They need help. They need the United States and they need China. They need the countries that have the capacity to produce the stuff that they need. Otherwise, they're going to use coal. So it requires international cooperation, international support for developing nations. Companies can't do that. It has to be the governments working together. So this is why we're in that film, we're talking about more government, but it's in a very particular area. We're not saying the government ought to be in your bedroom more often, which is some political parties in the United States want. No, it has nothing to do with that. And it's not necessarily the government doing it. The federal government employees are not going to erect solar panels.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need them to do that. What we need, or even build the grid, we need them to do the planning and organization and funding, helping fund, subsidize that new grid.
I guess my thoughts are that whenever you grant that power, usually it's not given back. So in the short term, sure, we want to do climate, but who's to say the next admin doesn't want to do something that is not necessarily agreed upon by the public? And then the admin after that, they also want to do something that's not agreed upon by the public. I don't know. I guess I find it hard to find that much consensus to go all in on, whether it be climate or whether it be, any other hot button thing that you want to push the agenda forward on. So I always just do wonder, like, okay, well, what happens after that one? And then after that one and that one? Are we just granting a lot of authority to the government to do massive spending and massive projects that, like I said, I just haven't seen them prove we're super good at doing these enormous projects and producing very efficient outcomes.
Another thing in the film is there's a long segment on the last time we did anything like this, which was World War II. We had a completely planned economy. The government was involved in everything, and survival of the nation was at risk. The government, just think about this. The government was 3%, federal government was 3% of the economy before FDR came in. And then he had a whole bunch of New Deal programs. The United States was an undeveloped country when FDR came in. Hard to believe. Now, of course, we had New York City. Of course, we had very developed and very sophisticated industry in parts of the country. But there's no electricity in huge parts of the country. We were underdeveloped in most of the country. The New Deal plus World War II is what developed America. So we go from 3% of the economy to 50% of the economy with FDR.
So they're putting money into the economy to go out and build roadways, and bridges, and
airports. Those were all built. I'm not sure that this was the plan, but the reason we were able to prosecute and win World War II is because of the New Deal, which started long before World War II. Okay, so maybe it was a coincidence that, boy, it sure turned out to be good that we built 20,000 airports.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and facilities to produce electricity and all that stuff. But anyway, that is what developed America. It was moving from 3 to 50%. Okay, now the war ends. What do? They transition back to private production for consumption, and the government shrank to 25%. Okay, so we have a precedent for going big, going to 25. We don't go to 3. The government stays at 25% ever since. It's never grown. I know that is shocking to a lot of Americans. The federal government has not grown since 1960. It's no bigger than it was.
You mean the as a percentage of GDP?
Yes. State and local governments grew because we had the baby boom. So the baby boom led to the creation of all the suburbs and schools and all that stuff for the baby boomers. So that's when the state and local governments grew, but they have not grown since 1974. Into the baby boom, they stopped growing too. So our total government has not grown at all since you've been alive. I mean, what year did you say?
I'm 32, so I was born in 91.
Okay. Since your parents were alive, the government in the United States has not grown at all.
And you think the size of the U.S. government is about appropriate?
Yeah, I think that between 25 and 50, so us and France, I think that you don't notice a big difference.
Okay.
Really.
Bigger doesn't maybe help past a certain point.
They have, everyone has a much better healthcare system than we have. Okay, we've got the worst. But we spend more on it.
Right, yeah.
As anybody else. Twice as much as anybody else. But they have the government more involved. I don't know France for sure. I know England better. The government is more involved actually in the delivery of it. It's not just the government gives the money, right? They're actually involved in the delivery. We don't do that. But yeah, I think for the most part, 25 to 50 seems to be the sweet spot. And it's a big range, but it seems to work okay.
So what happens as your government becomes smaller than that? You said Mexico, 13%. Yeah. Maybe that's not a representative example. I'm not sure about the politics of Mexico and things that will obviously derail governments like corruption and war and things of that nature. But what would happen as my government gets smaller? Alex's fundamental standpoint would be like, let's remove as much government as possible. I don't think we can remove all government. I don't know if anarchy is the right way to go. But if I'm removing, chunks, 5, 10%, what am I losing by doing that?
Well, the capacity, I think, to provide what the private sector needs, including households and firms, both.
Okay. How do you mean?
Well, you need infrastructure.
Okay.
And if you compare, say, China's infrastructure and the United States, we are falling behind. I'm sorry to say.
I know I've heard you talk about that.
It's going to be shocking to most Americans because, we're used to thinking, when I was a kid, you better finish your dinner because there's 1 billion starving Chinese. Well, that's not true anymore. The development of infrastructure in China is absolutely phenomenal. And we have very little. Our bridges are falling down. Our American Society of Engineers has a rating for our infrastructure by type of infrastructure, and we're getting Ds. The stuff is falling apart because it was built in that period when the government was spending more. First, the federal government, but then the state and local governments. But they're not anymore. So the bridges are falling down. The infrastructure deficit, I don't know the current number, but they come up with a number. But what I remember was something like $7 trillion. It's a lot. And the government doesn't operate the tractors, but they spend. They're the ones that pay for it. And we need more infrastructure investment. And now we shouldn't be focusing so much on highways. We should be focusing on alternatives.
Rails. We don't have any trains hardly in Columbus where I am. I saw some when I was coming up this way. But in Columbus, that's a big talking point is people want rails.
It's by far the most efficient way to move things. And, sending stuff across the country on trucks, I don't want to get in trouble with truckers, but sending stuff across the country on trucks is absolutely crazy.
No. I mean, I don't think a trucker would disagree with you that filling up their pickup and then driving it 600 miles, like there's a better way of doing that. If there was a more direct, less fuel efficient pathway where one person with only 26 pallets gets to move that, I mean, I think they would pretty readily agree with you. That's not to say that they want to lose their job and become a train operator, but I think that most people would agree that it is pretty inefficient. And, we see that firsthand when we order products. Sometimes the truck won't even be full. Sometimes it'll just have our stuff on it. And you go, oh, geez, well, that's only 6 pallets. You're missing 20 pallet spaces. And you're like, well, we were coming from Idaho and there was nothing in between that needed to get moved to Columbus, Ohio, at least based on our ability to pull in those resources. I only have a couple of other questions, that I kind of still have written down, but I know the job guarantee was something that I've seen other people in this space talk about. Can you tell me what your viewpoint is on that idea of the job guarantee? I don't know if that's a core tenet of MMT.
It's not a tenet. It's the best known policy that's advocated. So it's a policy, but it does serve a purpose related to sort of the whole theory.
And I do think one thing I'll say is I think it's important to differentiate between MMT as a analysis of the way that the financial markets work of sovereign countries, and then the what does this mean? Let's describe some things that we think would be beneficial for the United States or these other countries. Because you can disagree with these things over here on the right and go, well, I think those are dumb, but then that doesn't necessarily invalidate these things on the other side of the ledger that you could say, all right, well, that does seem actually factual, that the government does not need my money. They can create money. And inflation is the thing that they're worried about, not running out of money.
Yeah, agree. The policy proposals are added on, and not all MMT supporters agree on, what the correct policies are. One is the zero interest rate policy. Not all of them advocate that. Some MMT proponents advocate stop selling bonds. I personally don't.
Why would they want to not sell bonds?
Well, the government doesn't really need to borrow. So why sell bonds?
What I heard on that explanation, because I heard someone say, well, why does the government sell bonds if they can create money? And then people were really puzzled. And I was a bit puzzled too myself. I'm like, that does make sense. Why would they do that? The best explanation I heard was just delaying things out into the future. You can essentially delay these expenses for some period of time. Do you buy that or no?
No. So there's a technical reason in the United States why we need to do it. And that is, okay, this is going to take a little while.
We'll try to get Steve on board.
Remember when I said when the government spends, the Fed makes the payment for the Treasury.
Yep.
So they credit reserves. Now, when the Fed credits a bank's reserves because somebody received a Treasury check, the Fed simultaneously debits the Treasury's deposit at the Fed. The Treasury keeps an account at the Fed.
Okay.
Okay?
And the Treasury has a bank account at
Yes,
the Fed?
That's right.
And it would not be zero. It would not be the Fed's account stays at zero. The Treasury's is going to go up and down.
That's right. It goes up and down every day. Minute by minute, it's going up and down. When you pay your taxes, remember the Fed will debit some bank's reserve.
I remember that they burn it. That was pretty explicit that's what happened is they burnt it.
But they don't receive cash anymore. So what they do now is they debit the bank's reserves, and at the same time, they credit the Treasury's account. Okay? So taxes lead to an increase of the Treasury's account.
Yep.
Spending leads to a decrease of the Treasury's account. And we have a rule that says the Treasury should not run overdrafts.
Okay.
You've probably run an overdraft at your bank, maybe intentionally, maybe not.
Me, never.
It's common, especially in other countries, to have an automatic overdraft facility where they just charge you a little fee or some interest.
It's almost like it becomes a credit card at that point. That's actually a good idea. I like that.
Okay. Well, in many countries, it's just routine. You get it with your bank account. Okay. The Treasury is not supposed to have overdrafts. The Fed is not supposed to allow that. And so
what's the logic for that?
Well, they thought this would constrain Treasury spending, but it doesn't. Okay, because they have workarounds.
All right.
And so one of the workarounds is that the Treasury sells bonds. When the Treasury sells a bond, let's say you buy it.
Yep. So I'm assuming that I'll get a rate of return on this bond of 6% in 1 year's time. So I buy $1,000 bond, and I'm assuming I'm going to get my $60, $1,060 at the end of that 1 year period.
Okay. And you either have a direct debit from your bank account or you write a check to the Treasury.
Okay. They get my money, they get my $1,000.
So your deposit is debited and your bank's reserves are debited.
My account goes down and my bank's account goes down.
That's right.
That would make sense.
And the Treasury's account at the Fed goes up.
Goes up, baby. They got my $1,000.
That's how they make sure that they don't run an overdraft.
Oh, I see.
So they're selling bonds continually, and you can buy them. I buy them through treasurydirect.gov.
You're a bond purchaser.
Anybody can do that. And it's very easy to do. You can even buy inflation index if you want. But anyway, most of the bonds are not sold to people like you and me. Mm-hmm. They're sold through dealer banks.
Okay.
So we have a dozen dealer banks that are the big banks you've heard of that attain the status of being a dealer bank, which is like a go-between. They will always place bids for a coming auction, and they must do it. So the Treasury is going to auction 10-year bonds, and they must place a bid. What price will they pay? And then the price is sort of the inverse of the interest rate they'll earn.
Okay.
So that's the way they work. They don't have a stated interest rate, but you buy a $100 bond for $90, let's say.
Got it.
I'm going to bid 90.
Got it.
Okay. The Treasury can take it or leave it. So what they usually will do, of course, they're going to take the highest ones because
makes sense.
National, and they will go down the list until they've sold as much as they want. And so the lucky dealers get them. The unlucky who bid too low don't get any. Now, the dealers will just place those into the market. They'll find someone else who wants to buy.
Would they make a markup then?
Yeah, they do. This is profitable. That's why they want to be a dealer bank.
Got it.
So they all want to be dealer banks. They all must place bids. So you can be pretty sure the bonds are going to get sold, okay, because you're going to get the bids. The Treasury talks to them to find out what they want. And they, if they hear, a lot of complaining about 10 years, people don't really want the 10 years. They want 30 years. Treasury will sell more 30 years.
30, yeah. Well, geez.
Okay. Well, whatever. Or they may...
I don't know where I'm going to be in 10, let alone 30.
Just recently, they've been sort of cool on the 10-year, and they've been wanting a shorter term.
Yeah.
Fed's going to raise it.
Yes.
So anyway, they're always there. They're always buying. Now, what would happen if, for some reason, the dealer banks are having trouble selling them? The Fed can buy them.
Oh.
The Fed, can go into the market anytime it wants and buy bonds if the market is sort of slow. And the Treasury...
That's after the bond went to the dealer bank?
Yes.
Okay.
The Fed cannot buy them from the Treasury. The Fed can buy them from anyone except the Treasury. It's sort of a strange thing. The Fed is part of government. The Treasury is part of government. The Fed cannot buy bonds from the Treasury, but it can buy them from any bank that wants to sell them. So why did they do that? Because they don't want the Treasury to borrow from the Fed.
Because the Fed will just create that money.
Because then it would be like, oh, you're monetizing the debt. So back in 1913...
Selling the debt that the Fed created.
Yeah.
Or you're selling the capital that the Fed created. Am I following that?
Well, no, it would be the Fed is financing the Treasury. They want to maintain the illusion that the Treasury borrows from the public and uses tax revenue in order to spend.
You say they want to continue that illusion.
Yes.
We outed it here, though. Is that still a thing that they're trying to, is this like a cloak and dagger? Is this like a secret? I know you've talked about various Fed chairs talking about that when Congress asks them, where are we going to get the money? And they go, we're going to keystroke the money.
Yes.
Is it still true that they're not trying to say that out loud?
It's, when we started this in 1996, that's when MMT began, I can tell you that virtually no economist understood how the government really spent. That was our first project to see, how does the government spend? I actually wrote to economists, and then I wanted to find out if it's done the same way in Canada. So I wrote to some economists I knew. I have no idea how the Canadian government spends. Nobody knew. And so the very first thing we did, and Stephanie Kelton, Scott Fulwiler, Eric Tamoyne have all fine-tuned it to down where we know exactly what they do. So they created all of these procedures that are a roundabout way to do two things. One, to make sure the Treasury's balance at the Fed never goes to zero.
Okay.
So they've always got money in there.
The bond sale.
Yes. The bond sale. There are other ways too.
Nope.
And then the second one was because whenever the Treasury spends, you put reserves into the banks. Whenever the Treasury taxes, you take reserves out. Well, this is very inconvenient for the banks because Treasury operations are big. We're talking about billions a day, billions a minute of reserves going in and out, in and out. And in the old days, before QE, banks didn't want to hold any excess reserves, and the Fed paid no interest on reserves. So what would happen is the interest rate would go to zero. Because of Treasury spending, putting reserves in the system that the banks didn't want and couldn't earn anything, they'd be trying to get them off their own balance sheet onto somebody else's. The interest rate would go to zero.
But wouldn't it have been a beneficial thing for the Treasury to have some amount of money because they're not allowed to go negative?
The Treasury has already spent, put reserves into the banks. So the problem is in the banking system. It's not the Treasury's problem. It's the Fed's problem because the Fed doesn't want a zero interest rate normally. Okay? And so they developed these procedures. The second reason was to make sure that you're always draining the reserves out to make sure banks don't have extra. How can you drain reserve? You sell bonds. So the Fed and the Treasury coordinate every morning to make sure that the Treasury will be selling enough bonds to drain out the reserves that its spending will put in that day. Because by the end of the day, they had to make sure there's no excess reserves, or the overnight rate goes to zero. Fed funds rate goes to zero.
I again go back. This sounds like a whole hell of a lot of process that it maybe does it need to exist? I'm still kind of coming back to that. Like, does this need to exist? Like, could we go without this? And I know we're talking about the job guarantee, but a lot of people are advocating at this current moment in time. We'll come back to the job guarantee because I think it's important. A lot of people are advocating, well, why don't we go back to a fixed currency so we don't have to mess with this? What is your thoughts on a fixed rate currency?
Oh, we would still have to do all this.
We would still have to.
Oh, yeah, and it would be much more difficult.
It'd be worse.
Yes, because to peg your currency, there are a few things you can do as the government, Treasury and central bank together. And one thing that currency peggers do is they use their interest rate.
Okay.
So if there is downward pressure on your currency, say you're an importer like the U.S. it is.
Yep. We import more goods than we export.
Then your currency is going
Money is leaving the country net at a higher rate than it is coming in.
It's going into the exchange markets. So the supply of your currency in foreign exchange markets is going up. All else equal, that's going to cause the value of currency to go down. So
why would it cause the value of your currency?
Well, because you're offering more, let's say your pesos.
Your supply is too high.
You're offering more pesos than the market wants.
I see.
What's going to happen? Your value of the peso goes down.
Okay.
So what since peso, let's say Mexico, what Mexico has to do is use their interest rate to increase the demand for their currency. Now, why would it do that? Because if Mexico's interest rate is a lot higher than anybody else, you will want peso assets.
The interest rate that they set on what? On the bond sale? I'm a little confused.
The overnight rate. So the central bank generally sets that one rate, but all the other rates, if we raise the overnight rate, Fed funds rate in the U.S., all other rates go up. So that's what they will do. They will raise their overnight rate target, and all rates will go up. And then the idea is that foreigners will want Mexican peso assets, not the pesos themselves, okay, not the coins or anything. They want assets in Mexico because the interest rates are higher.
So, would a decent example be I buy an apartment building in Mexico and then I'm doing rent? I'm just trying to understand where I get that extra interest.
Financial assets.
Okay, so a bond, a government sold bond that they're going to pay a higher rate of interest on?
Government bonds, corporate bonds.
Corporate bonds. I see, because if the interest rate is high, then all the other interest rates out there, buying and selling, have to be similar to that.
Yes.
So if Mexico's interest rate is 6%, then maybe, hey, I'm a corporate bond and 6%'s not good enough. No one would buy my corporate bond for 6%. I need to go to 8%. So then you would want to buy that corporate bond in Mexico, and you'd pay pesos for it because it's a higher rate of return.
Yep.
Am I tracking?
Yeah. So in a way, you're losing control of your interest rate because you have to focus on the exchange rate. And maybe you don't want a higher interest rate in your economy because you're sluggish and people aren't buying houses.
The peso's not great. That's going to be bad for everybody if the peso interest rate is extremely high.
So you have to use your interest rate policy to stabilize your exchange rate rather than benefit your own economy. That's the problem. So that's a typical way to do it, to manage your exchange rates. So you lose some policy control
if you're on that fixed rate currency.
And then finally, you've got to find a way to earn that currency you have pegged to, or to gold.
Right.
You need a gold flow into your country on a gold standard, or you need a dollar flow into your country on a dollar standard. How can you do that? The typical way is to make your labor cheap.
So let's say that the U.S., we flick a wand and we're back to the gold standard. The U.S. government has to get that gold to have the ability to peg their money to it. And to get that gold, you're saying their labor is going to be cheap.
Yep. Make your labor cheap. Because then you can export.
Like you mean our like private sector labor? How would that put gold into the Fed's literal vault?
Well, see, the dollar is pegged to gold, so the value of the dollar can't change.
Yep.
But the price of your output can change.
Price of my output.
And labor is a major component of the cost of producing. So if we can cut our wages in half, we're going to be more internationally competitive.
Yep.
And how can we cut our wages in half? Well, cause massive unemployment.
Okay.
So your monetary policy is not independent. You got to target the interest rate to create a demand for your currency. And your fiscal policy is no longer independent. You've got to crush the economy in order to make labor cheap, to make your exports cheap, so that you can get the gold flowing in the old days. Today, it would be to get the dollar flowing into your country, if you're not the U.S.
And regardless of what you pick as what you're pegging it to, whether it be gold or cryptocurrency or something like that, it's fundamentally going to operate the same way. You still have to get that like if we decide to go to Bitcoin, the U.S. government has to somehow get the Bitcoin. Okay, now here's a really crazy question. What if the government just said, hey, we're not involved in the money system any longer. It's a total free market money system. We will let the market decide what is money. How would you view a situation like that?
It's never been tried. I can't speculate.
Maybe 10,000 years ago.
No. There's never been money without an authority, whether it was a temple or a king or a democratic government. So I can't speculate. Even, when the Soviet Union was formed and they're socialist, the government created the monetary system. I don't. We just don't have examples of anything like a modern economy that doesn't have a government. So I don't know.
Appreciate that. Back to the job guarantee then. What benefit do you think that would give to American people in the U.S. economy?
Okay. So one way to come at this is to look at Powell. So we've got an inflation problem, and the traditional way to deal with inflation is to try to increase unemployment.
Interest rates drive them up.
So we're trying to get people to lose their jobs, create slack in the labor force, because the idea is if you have a big enough group of unemployed people, they will bid the wages down.
Because they will take the jobs that are paying the least.
Well, they'll take your job and do it for less. So you will lose the job, they will get it. Well, that's the theory.
Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know if I buy it, but
I can tell you this is the way they think. This is the way orthodoxy thinks. And Greenspan said it in the open.
But I mean, I guess that sort of doesn't reconcile with me because we have a minimum wage. So it's like, if someone's already being paid minimum wage, I guess then you could replace them with someone who's slightly better at your job that would pay minimum wage. But
But anyway, so with the minimum wage, yes, that's the floor. The legal floor. So there are ways to get around that. And, there are large parts of the economy where it's not, the minimum wage doesn't apply. So supposedly self-employed people, minimum wage doesn't apply. It doesn't apply to some kinds of...
It's true. I have worked for no money for very long.
Well, in most states, it doesn't apply to...
It'd be great if
the wait staff.
The government would pay me for my building my business in the short term.
Okay, so anyway, that's the theory. So what you need is, we can call this a buffer stock. It's a buffer stock of unemployed people. They are there to reduce the pressure on wages, to reduce inflation. Because the theory is if that buffer stock gets really small, like it did after COVID, right?
Yeah, it was extremely, sorry to interrupt you, but I'll just comment from personal experience that it was extremely difficult to hire anyone after COVID. I think also part of that was there was a lot of unemployment being paid in the checks. That's just my opinion on it, but that was what it felt like.
Yep. So in those conditions, there's wage pressure because there's hardly anyone you can hire to replace the guy who's asking for the $5 an hour wage increase.
We hired some bad people for higher wages than they deserve. That's no doubt.
Okay. So we can call that a buffer stock of the unemployed. And there's nothing new about this idea. It wasn't even created by orthodox economists. Karl Marx used to talk about the reserve army of the unemployed.
Okay.
They keep wages down. And so capitalism, he argued, wants a large reserve army of the unemployed. Okay. So one way of looking at a job guarantee is that rather than those people becoming unemployed, they become an army of the employed that's available to be hired. So you can think of it, and Warren Moser puts it this way. I'll go beyond this because I'm not fully on board with this view, but it's a way to approach it. It's a transitional job. So you take this job, you work in a job guarantee program, but you're available to be hired away. And you're a better reserve army. Now, why are you a better reserve army than someone who's unemployed? Because we know from surveys what unemployed people do. Okay, they develop bad habits. They watch lots of TV,
drink alcohol, smoke marijuana.
And then there's the drugs.
Well, I'm sure we've seen some of the similar studies that's real. It's definitely a real thing.
It's a real thing, okay? If they're unemployed and they went back to college, completely different matter. But that's just not the reality that we get from surveys of how they spend the extra time when they've lost their job. And so that's from the supply side. From the demand side, how much do you like hiring someone who's been unemployed for a year?
I've heard you guys talk about this. To me, it's not necessarily that they have been unemployed for a year. It depends on what job, right? If I'm trying to hire a computer programmer and they say, I don't know, man, I was just kind of bumming around, you might be like, that's a weird answer. If they're like, hey, I made $1 million working at Netflix and took a year off and went to Bali, I'd be like, that's pretty baller. I wish I could do that. If they're a warehouse worker and they've been unemployed for a year, that wouldn't faze me as much as if they fundamentally couldn't get a job for a year. There's probably like a reason for that. And usually you'll be able to spot that in the interview.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, again, we know from studies that the longer you're unemployed,
I would imagine just the less likely you are to go back. Be like, shoot, I made it 12 months being unemployed. Maybe I can just keep it going.
Well, we could go way deeply into this. Most unemployed people go out of the labor force and not into jobs. Most of the people who come into jobs come from out of the labor force. So there's lots of movement between the categories.
Okay.
Someone who's unemployed may be unemployed for a period, and they're out of the labor force for a period. Then they come back into unemployment, or they go into a job.
Yep.
So there's lots of transitioning. But I'm talking about someone who is long-term unemployed, week after week. When you interview unemployed, they are very unlikely to get jobs after 6 months to a year of unemployment.
Part of what you're talking about is that when someone discontinues their search for a new job, they are no longer unemployed, which is sort of like seems like an accounting quirk, right?
Well, they're trying to get at, do you really want a job? And if you're not looking, that's a little bit of evidence. You're right. It's not completely determining. So
We'll call it unjobbed. The unjobbed.
in lots of respects, people out of the labor force, a group of those out of the labor force look very much like people who are unemployed, but a lot of the people out of the labor force don't look like people who are unemployed officially. So anyway, so on the demand side, also there's a stigma, is what I'm saying. A stigma of being unemployed for a long time. So when instead, if you're in the reserve army of the employed, otherwise called the job guarantee program, you are showing up to work. You have a work history. You're demonstrating you really are available to work because you are working. You are potentially a better hire than someone who's unemployed, especially long term. And you can make it even better than that if the job guarantee program is well run, so that people are getting skills on the job. Maybe they're in the equivalent of an apprenticeship program in some kind of construction project, so that you can you can provide the evidence of what you've done on the job. You can have recommendations from the employer in the job guarantee program and so on. So you're actually a better reserve army of the employed. You do a better job of keeping wage pressure down than people who are unemployed and maybe unemployable. So that's the idea. That's one way of looking at what a job guarantee is. It's a substitute for unemployment, but it still serves the purpose of keeping wage pressures down because all those people in the program are available and demonstrating they are.
I have a couple of comments and also questions, but what would you envision these people working on?
Yeah. So proponents of the job guarantee, including MMT proponent, but there are many proponents of job guarantee.
It sounds great. Everybody gets a job.
People are employed. And so, my colleague, Pavlina Cherneva at the Levy Institute, she's actually now the president. She was my student, wrote a book on the job guarantee. So hers is, three categories. Let me see if I can get them right. They're serving the community. Oh boy, I'm not going to get it right. They are sort of social service jobs that provide service to the community, service to families, and something else that are in social service type activities.
Okay.
Now, the model is the New Deal. There were a bunch of jobs programs in the New Deal. Remember I said that we developed the United States with the New Deal. The New Deal jobs programs employed 13 million people. The biggest was the Works Progress Administration, WPA, which built, I think they built our post office here, offices all over the country, schools all over the country. Oh, the Columbia River Dam. I think it was the biggest project the U.S. had ever undertaken. Those were job guarantee programs that took the unemployed, trained them, built dams. So massive infrastructure. They built the airports, they built the roads, the Taconic Highway in New York. Yeah, you're not from the East Coast.
I'm from Columbus.
It's a big deal. It was the first 4-lane highway in the United States. They built other programs with the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, that planted billions of trees all over the country. So all those kinds of things were done. So that's a model. Generally, today, most proponents of the job guarantee don't envision building dams or things like that.
I was about to say.
Because the time has changed. You use heavy machinery, you don't use shovels. So, and it's all contracted out now. And you'd be taking jobs away from contractors. There's no point in doing that.
Yeah, I was going to say that I sort of know who some of these people are. We've probably hired and fired 60 to 70 people, which it's not very many. I get that. There's people who've done 5, 10, 15, 100,000 people through their company, but we hire a lot of hourly workers. So I sort of understand who these people fundamentally are. And I do wonder out loud if some of the people who are advocating for this have not met these people. And I'm not trying to be critical of these types of people, but we start people at $18 an hour, which I think is a decent wage. It's higher than a lot of businesses will start these folks at. And these people just have behaviors that just would be illogical to you or I, that they'll walk outside and then they'll hit their weed pen. And it's like, you are on company property. You are right next to the FedEx driver. You can't smoke weed right here. Like, how do you not fundamentally grasp that? I just didn't think it would be a big deal. So they engage in these behaviors that you or I would just find to be just ridiculous. And that's why a lot of these people are unemployed. And I'm not even talking about the worst people who show up to work drunk. Like, we don't really have that. But these are generally what I would imagine the people who can't, like, keep a job do. They engage in behaviors like that. So I say all that to say, one, I don't think you want them building bridges. And two, I just fundamentally wonder out loud, like, how productive this group of people would be, because essentially what you're doing is saying, like, here's the worst. Maybe half of the unemployed people are legit good people looking for jobs. And then as you, maybe it's a different percentage than that. A good percentage of the people who cannot keep a job, hold a job, find a job are chronic, problematic people in the workplace. So I just kind of wonder out loud, like, geez, like, not to say what do you do with these people, but how productive would that workforce actually be?
Okay, so every employer, whether they're public or private, faces this problem, and the answer would be the one that you gave. You fire them.
Can they be fired? But it's a guarantee, though, I thought.
No. It's guaranteed that there is a job available.
It's guaranteed that you get a start, but not necessarily so.
I wouldn't quite say it's guaranteed that you get a start. Okay, you've got to, you show up drunk at the job interview, you don't get the start. Okay, so
good. I like that.
The grounds for firing would be, legally constrained, just as you are, but they would be the same. So if they don't hold up the standard for that job, they get fired. Now, it could be not their fault. Okay, it's a job they can't do, right? So you took a chance, but no, actually, they can't do that job. In that case, then they can try another one. If it's because they showed up once drunk, they're fired. Yeah, they get a second chance at another job. But beyond some point, you say, sorry, this program's not for you. Okay? So you're only taking people ready and willing to work. And then ability is a somewhat different from the private sector because, of course, there's laws against discriminating against people with disabilities. But with the job guarantee program, we can be even more accepting because it's not necessary to make profit. So the private sector has to make profit to stay in business. These are not for-profit jobs. They are, people always want to know, is it the federal government providing the jobs? In some proposals for job guarantees, some people want these all to be federal government jobs. I don't. Pavlina doesn't. The people associated with the UMKC version of job guarantee don't want the federal government to run the program. They want them to fund it and to decentralize the program to not-for-profits, to school districts, state and local governments, where they would all put forward proposals. They have to be approved at several levels, say local, could be district, could be county, could be, and then state. Finally, also approved at the federal level because it's federal government spending. So the proposals have to go through and they have to meet objective standards, and the proposers have to meet standards. So, what is it that they're doing now? Is it the Red Cross? They've got a history. They can show what they are able to do, and make a reasonable proposal for how they can expand their current operations. If they had more workers, then their project would get approved. They would be able to hire 100 new workers. Federal government will pay the wage, maybe something towards the overhead. You want to keep that low because you don't want anyone creating jobs just to get the overhead. But sharing some of the costs of employing them.
I have a friend actually who owns I think it's a for-profit, privately owned company that does something kind of similar. He has disabled individuals that he helps take into businesses that have like relatively repetitive tasks. So he has a lot of people who have like autism and things like that, where they can still like do a job, but they almost actually like to do repetitive tasks. And he gets a stipend from the government, which lowers your bill. So whereas you might pay $15 an hour, he's like, we can come in and bring in $8 an hour labor, and then the government fills in, and then I can actually make a little profit on the top of that. I view that kind of not that dissimilar, actually.
Yeah, the only big difference is most job guarantee proposers want to keep this in the not-for-profit sector just because of the competitive advantage you might give if you start supplying free workers to some for-profit firms, but not others. So we want to stay out of that and not allow for-profits to do it. So it would have to be ones that qualify for, tax, not for-profits. And state and local governments and school districts and all that stuff.
Randy, I know we've covered a ton of different topics. Is there anything that we didn't cover about MMT that you think is really important to hit on? Proposals, ideas, or just, fundamental things that you want to get out there?
No, it is too hard to think of any. I think the most important thing we've been trying to do is to change the discussion away from President Obama's claim we ran out of money to focusing on resource availability, on inflation potential, on, things you're worried about, capacity to run the programs, competency, avoiding fraud. Those are all real issues. Mm-hmm. Getting the government to do something and do it well. Can they do that? That's an issue. Can the government afford to do it is not an issue. Mm. So if we could just get that out, without the job guarantee, without the Green New Deal, if people would understand, the people who make the decisions, you understand, but I'm talking about the people who are making the decisions in Washington and at state and local government levels too, that Uncle Sam cannot run out of money. Money is never the problem, that it is approving the spending and then doing well, managing the program. Then we would have accomplished the most important thing by far.
And inflation also, is that the boogeyman? Like, is inflation the boogeyman? That's kind of the way that I'm tracking things.
Well, it has been for the United States, for Japan. Inflation is a huge deal in many countries. Brazil is a sovereign currency country. Inflation has been a big problem for a long time. Now, the United States had inflation problems in the 70s. And in the 80s, so beginning in the 1990s, we did not have inflation problems. And the Fed took all the credit for that. Fed says, it's because, we became so proactive. We prevent inflation. It had nothing to do with the Fed. The Fed, if you look at their interest rate policy, they're going up and down, but inflation is horizontal. Mm. Jiggling around all the time. There was no inflation pressure. but the reason was because the global economy had changed tremendously with the entry mainly of China, but of other Asian countries. India is sort of there too, and possibly a new big entrant into the global economy. That's what kept inflation pressure down. And so for a very long time, we don't need to worry about inflation, which was true. Things have changed because of COVID. So, I mean, things changed because COVID was here, but they've changed after COVID too. Because we found that, and this wasn't a surprise, people were warning about it, that these long, complex supply chains are open to many problems. So COVID was one, but earthquakes is another, and bad weather is another.
So ships getting lodged in the Panama Canal.
Yeah, and war in the Middle East.
Oh, yeah.
So they're not going to come back to the same extent. And now we also have sort of a Cold War going on. So we're purposely keeping Chinese products out and not sharing technology and so on. So things have changed. Global supply chains are not going to come back. The transition is a bit uncertain. So we're going to be favoring domestic firms producing more at home, I think, and probably more in Mexico, less in Asia. So things are a bit uncertain. And so I think that inflation should be on our minds in a way that it did not need to be on our minds, even though it was for 25 years. But the global economy is different now. And climate change makes things different too. Climate change is going to be extremely inflationary. Insurance alone is going to skyrocket.
I've heard that discussion.
So we do need to continue worrying about inflation. I don't think we need to continue fighting it the way that we've been fighting it, but we need to do what we can to minimize the potential for inflation pressures.
Randy, I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to us and explain some of these topics. This has been a lot of fun.
Okay, fun for me too.
Where can people find you and catch up with some of the information that you've put out, and where would be maybe some resources that people could learn a little bit about the information presented here? Okay,
a short email, I think technically it's not correct, but it works. www.levy.org. That's where much of my research is all freely available. Just go to the website, and it's all listed by author. So you put my name in, it's there. And there's plenty of other stuff on many other topics. Levy Institute does research in lots of different areas. So that would be the place. Now, these tend toward academic to targeted toward policymakers. So some is a bit more complex. For something much simpler, an introduction, I can give two of my own piece of books to recommend. One is Money for Beginners, and that is a cartoon book, which presents modern money theory through cartoons and words. So that would be the simplest introduction to it. And then Making Money Work for Us, which is at a bit higher level. So let's say at least high school graduate. That would be a good introduction at that level. And then the third edition of what we call the Money Primer, Modern Money Theory, I think is the title, just came out. And that one is a little bit higher, say if you've got some college, and goes into more details than the other ones. So those three books would be three different.
Awesome. We'll link those in the description. Appreciate you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks.